I drove up the narrow mountain road in the late afternoon, feeling the usual quiet you get when you leave the towns far behind you. The sky had a pale look, the kind that comes before evening but still has enough light to show every ridgeline and every tree on the slopes. I had been planning this cabin trip for weeks, just a few days away from everything so I could breathe properly again. The cabin wasn't mine. It used to belong to an old coworker who let people use it as long as they left it the way they found it. I had been there twice before. Both times were quiet and normal. This time I expected the same thing. I didn't think anything strange or dangerous would happen. If I had known anything, I would have turned the car around as soon as I passed the last gas station. The air smelled like pine and damp earth when I stepped out of the car. The cabin was just a small wooden building sitting back between the trees. It had one door, two small windows, and a metal chimney pipe that ran up the side. The place always felt a little too quiet, but I liked that feeling. I thought it made me feel grounded. I liked hearing nothing except wind moving through branches and the sound of my boots stepping on old leaves and dirt. I unlocked the door and went inside. The smell inside the cabin was always the same. Old wood, a bit of dust, something like dried pine needles, and the faint smell of the small propane heater even when it was turned off. I placed my bag on the wooden table and started unpacking the same way I always did. I put my food in the little cupboard, placed my clothes on the single chair by the bed, and set my flashlight on the nightstand. Back then, I didn't think I would be gripping that flashlight so tightly a few hours later that my hand would hurt for days. I stepped outside again to chop some firewood. I wanted enough for the next 2 nights. The trees made long shadows on the ground as the sun lowered behind the ridge. I could feel the air changing, getting colder, sharper. While I chopped the wood, I kept hearing the sound of branches snapping somewhere deeper in the trees. It didn't seem strange at first. Animals moved around this place all the time. I had seen deer, elk, even a black bear once far up the slope. But the snapping kept happening, almost in a pattern, and after a few minutes, I noticed something. Every time I stopped chopping, the sound stopped too. It was like whatever was causing the noise didn't want to make it when I wasn't making my own noise. I didn't think much of it yet. I told myself it was just the usual forest shifting around as the temperature dropped. The ground was covered in dry branches. A deer could easily cause the same thing. I tried not to let my mind think anything else. When I finished collecting enough wood, I carried the pieces inside and stacked them near the heater. The cabin was dim, so I turned on the small battery-powered lamp that I brought with me. I set it on the table and started heating some canned food on the little gas stove. Outside, the woods had already turned dark. I could only see the outline of the closest trees through the window. Everything behind them looked like a single black shape. I ate my food slowly, listening to the heater crack gently in the corner. I started feeling calm again. The strange snapping noises from earlier slipped out of my mind. After I cleaned up, I sat on the edge of the bed. The air inside the cabin had warmed up, and I felt myself getting tired from the long drive. I lay down on the bed without even changing into warm clothes, and after a few minutes, I drifted into sleep. I woke up to a sound that didn't belong inside or outside the cabin. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't animals stepping on branches. It was softer than that. It was careful. It was slow. It sounded like someone placing one foot gently on dry leaves, lifting it, and then placing it again. I lay there without moving, letting my ears focus. I could hear the sound coming from the right side of the cabin, the side where the small window was. The lamp on the table was still glowing, but it had dimmed as the batteries drained. The cabin had that uneasy half-light feeling, where everything looks slightly wrong because you can't see everything clearly. My heart started to beat faster when I heard the sound again. It wasn't an animal. I had heard animals many times on my past trips. None of them moved like this. This sound had intention behind it. Someone was walking around the cabin. I slowly sat up, trying not to make any noise. I felt cold sweat forming across my forehead and under my arms. When I put my feet on the wooden floor, the boards made a faint creaking sound. The walking outside immediately stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, like someone was standing still and listening for any movement inside. I stayed frozen in place for almost a full minute. The silence stretched out, and my throat felt tight. Then I heard the sound again, but this time much closer to the window. It sounded like someone shifting their weight slowly, maybe leaning forward or crouching. I looked at the window, but I couldn't see anything except darkness outside. I reached for my flashlight as quietly as I could. When my fingers wrapped around it, I felt a bit better, but not enough to change how terrified I was. I stood up and moved slowly toward the window, stopping just a few steps from it. I didn't want to get too close. I didn't want the person outside to see my face through the glass. Another sound came. This time it was a faint scraping. Something touched the wall of the cabin. Something long, sliding gently downward. I didn't know what the person had in their hand. I didn't want to think about it. I stepped back from the window and turned off the lamp. The cabin fell into almost complete darkness except for the weak moonlight sneaking through the trees outside. My breathing felt loud even though I was trying my best to make it quiet. I waited. I didn't know what else to do. For a while, nothing happened. The outside stayed silent. The woods didn't even move. I thought maybe the person had walked away. But that hope ended when the sound returned. Not on the side window this time, but near the front door. The footsteps were heavier now, more direct. I could imagine someone standing right on the small step in front of the cabin. My chest felt tight. I could feel my heartbeat thudding all through my body. Then the door handle moved. Not fast, not like someone trying to break in. Slowly, carefully, like someone testing to see if it was locked. When it didn't turn, the person let go of the handle. I heard another step and then another. The person moved again around the cabin. I didn't understand why they were circling the place instead of trying to leave. It felt like they were trying to find a weakness, a loose window, a crack, a blind spot, something. I stepped deeper inside the cabin, staying away from the windows. I crouched behind the small kitchen counter. The flashlight felt heavy and useless in my hand. I thought about using it, but I didn't want to shine light outside and give away my position. The footsteps faded. I didn't know if the person walked away into the woods or just stopped moving again somewhere out of sight. Minutes passed. I kept waiting for another step or some kind of noise, but nothing came. My legs started to feel stiff from crouching. I remained frozen anyway. When at least 20 or 30 minutes passed with no sound at all, I started thinking maybe the person had left for real. But I didn't trust that thought. Felt too easy. I waited longer. My mouth felt dry. I could taste the metallic dryness of fear in my throat. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe more, I slowly stood up. My legs shook from staying tense for so long. I stayed far from the windows as I moved toward the bed. I didn't lay down. I just sat on the edge, listening. Nothing. The woods outside stayed dead quiet. I stayed awake the entire night, not even blinking for long stretches. Every creak the cabin made on its own made my heart jump. I didn't close my eyes once. Eventually, the dark outside began to shift into a faint gray. Morning light started touching the tops of the trees. Only then did I stand and move toward the window. I looked out slowly, expecting to see someone standing between the trees, watching me. But I didn't see anyone. The ground around the cabin looked normal at first glance. But when I looked closely, I saw marks in the dirt. Footprints, not animal prints. Shoe prints, fresh, clear. They circled the cabin unevenly, like someone had walked around it multiple times. I felt a wave of fear run down my back when I saw a deeper print right near the front door, the place where the person had stood when they tested the door handle. I put on my jacket and stepped outside, looking around carefully. The woods didn't look dangerous. They looked just like they always did. Tall trees, fallen leaves, a small fog hanging between the trunks. Everything looked normal, which somehow made everything worse. I walked around the cabin slowly, following the footprints. They went behind the cabin into the trees. I followed them only a short distance, just enough to see they continued deeper into the woods before fading into the uneven ground. I didn't want to follow any farther. I turned back toward the cabin. That was when I noticed something I had missed earlier. On the side wall of the cabin, just below the small window, there were scratch marks. Long, thin ones, as if someone had pressed something sharp against the wood and dragged it downward. Not deep enough to cut through the boards, but deep enough to leave a mark that didn't belong there. That was all I needed to see. I walked inside, grabbed my bag, and started packing everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept dropping things. I forced myself to stay quiet even though it was morning. Some part of me was still scared that whoever had been outside might still be hiding somewhere nearby. When I stepped out to put my bag in the car, I felt a heavy feeling at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I kept looking toward the trees, expecting to see someone standing still between the trunks, but I saw nothing. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove down the narrow road. I kept looking into the rearview mirror more than the road ahead. Every time I saw movement in the trees, even if it was just wind pushing branches, my stomach tightened. When I reached the main road, the tension in my chest loosened just a little. But even then, I didn't feel safe. Not fully. I kept driving all the way back into town without stopping once. At home, I sat in silence for a long time, thinking about every little detail from the night. I kept picturing the slow footsteps, the scratches on the wall, the sound of the door handle turning. I knew it wasn't an animal. I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there in the dark, walking around the cabin again and again, checking windows and doors, moving slowly like they had time and patience. Someone had been waiting for something, or someone. I didn't go to that cabin again. I didn't even tell the owner about what happened. I didn't want to talk about it at all. But I kept thinking about one thing. The footsteps had stopped the moment the floor creaked beneath my feet inside the cabin. That meant the person outside had been listening closely the whole time. That meant they were just a few feet away, quiet, focused, waiting to hear any sign from inside. They had stopped moving each time I stopped moving. They knew exactly where I was every moment without ever seeing me. The worst part, the part that stayed with me and still makes me feel sick when I think about it, was the scratch on the wall under the window. Not the scratch itself, but the height of it. It was almost exactly at the level of my chest when I had stood inside the cabin the night before. Whoever had been outside had pressed something sharp against the wood while crouching or leaning at the same height as my body on the other side of the wall, as if they were trying to picture exactly where I was standing. As if they were imagining the point where they would attack if the wall hadn't been there. That thought has never left me. That night taught me something I try not to think about too much. Sometimes the scariest things aren't sudden or violent. Sometimes the scariest things are the slow footsteps in the dark, the careful movements, the silent waiting, and the quiet hands testing the door when they think you might be asleep. It's knowing someone was inches away from you with bad intentions, hidden by nothing but a thin wooden wall, and knowing you might never know who it was or what they wanted, because they walked away into the woods like it was nothing. Maybe looking for another cabin, another person, another quiet place where someone sleeps thinking they're alone. I wasn't the last person to stay in that cabin, but I know one thing for sure. I was the last person to stay there alone and believe the silence of the forest meant safety. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon when the light was still soft and warm, resting low over the treetops in a way that made everything look quiet and clean. The air felt still, and I could smell the usual sharp mix of pine, old bark, and the faint damp scent that always comes from deep forest soil. I had been walking for hours since the dirt road ending point where I had left my car under a patch of trees. The cabin was deeper in the forest than I expected, but I kept my pace steady because I wanted to reach it before the shadows took over the trees. I was there for a research project, something that felt harmless and boring at first, but the deeper I walked into the trees, the more I felt the distance from people. I had no reason to be scared then, but I still kept remembering how far I was from any place where I could find help. When I reached the clearing, the cabin stood alone like it had been forgotten for years. It was made of rough wood that had turned dark from age and rain. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the windows were dusty with dirt and old spiderwebs. It looked the same as the pictures I had seen, but the pictures never showed how lonely it felt. There was no sound except the soft wind pushing through the needles of the tall pines. The air felt cool already, even though it was still daytime. I walked up to the cabin steps, which groaned under my weight as if they had not been used for a long time. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulders, full of notebooks, tools, and the small camera I would use to record and catalog old forestry equipment. The project seemed simple enough. Document whatever old relics I found around the property and inside the cabin. According to the notes I had been given, the place used to be a rest spot for forest workers long ago, and supposedly some old equipment might still be lying around. My job was only to take pictures, write details, and organize everything into files. A peaceful trip, or at least that was what I thought. I pushed the cabin door open, and it moved with a long, slow creak. The inside smelled like old wood mixed with dust and something else dry and stale, like clothes that had been left in a closed box for too long. The room was small, with a single old bed in the corner, a wooden table with marks and scratches on it, and a metal stove that looked like it had not been used in years. Dust floated in the air in thin layers that moved slowly whenever I stepped. I walked inside and put my backpack on the table. When the weight hit the wood, a small cloud of dust rose. I wiped the surface with my sleeve to make a clean space. The cabin felt empty in a way that did not match the sense of being watched that crept into me as I looked around. I had no reason to feel watched, but the silence felt heavy, almost thick, like the air inside had not been moved in a long time. I stood still for a moment, listening carefully. Nothing moved except the wind lightly hitting the side of the cabin. I started unpacking my things, taking out my notebooks, the camera, batteries, and the map that had been handed to me at the office. The map showed the cabin, a few paths leading away from it, and some locations where old tools or machines had been found in the past. Some markings were faded, and I guessed I would have to walk around a lot more than the map suggested. When I finished unpacking, I checked the inside of the cabin more closely. There wasn't much to look at, but I wanted to get familiar with the place since I would be staying there alone for the next days. The bed frame had a slight wobble. The mattress felt thin and uneven, and I wasn't sure how comfortable it would be, but I reminded myself that I wasn't here for comfort. The floorboards felt soft and old under my boots. The stove had rust on the edges. The small shelves in the corner were empty except for a few nails and what looked like a piece of broken glass. Everything seemed untouched for years, but something felt off. I noticed the floor had clear drag marks near the back wall. Long lines as if something heavy had been pulled across the wooden boards many times. They were not on the photos I had seen before. I crouched down and touched one of the marks. The wood felt smooth inside the dragged line, almost polished by friction. It did not look like the kind of mark that would be left by an old worker moving a tool long ago. It looked fresh enough to make me uneasy. I brushed dust off my hands, stood up, and tried to ignore the strange feeling. I told myself it might just be from wildlife or maybe from shifting furniture back when someone last cleaned the cabin. Still, the mark bothered me, and I kept looking back at it as I moved around the room. After a while, I went outside to check the small shed mentioned in the notes. The shed sat a short distance behind the cabin, half hidden under a cluster of tall bushes. The door was slightly open, which surprised me because the note said everything should be shut. I pushed the door, and it swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow space with old tools hanging on the walls. Rusted axes, dull saws, and broken handles were scattered around. Some pieces lay on the dirt floor, covered with old leaves and dust. I stepped inside carefully because I didn't trust the floor. Creaked loudly under my weight. I took pictures of the tools, trying to capture every angle for the record. When I knelt to pick up a small hand saw to inspect it, I noticed something strange under a pile of leaves. A footprint. Not old. Not shaped like a heavy boot from decades ago. It looked recent and clear, pressed deeply into the soft dirt. The size looked like it could belong to a grown man. I slowly stood up and my chest felt tight. I looked around the shed again, but everything stayed still. The forest outside was quiet, but the footprint stayed on my mind like a warning. It didn't fit the project. It didn't fit the idea that no one had used the place in years. I left the shed and closed the door behind me. I walked around the property to look for more traces. I saw small patches of disturbed ground near the trees, but nothing too clear. The unease grew inside me, but I told myself again that maybe it was just some hiker or forest worker passing by sometime recently. Still, the area was so remote that seeing signs of someone else felt almost unnatural. When I went back inside the cabin, the sun had moved lower, and the shadows inside were longer. I lit the small lantern I brought with me and placed it on the table. The warm yellow light filled the cabin but didn't remove the weight of silence. I sat on the bed and wrote a few notes about what I had seen so far. My handwriting looked shaky, and I kept pressing the pen too hard. I could see the drag marks on the floor even from where I sat. After a long time of sitting still, I ate a small meal from my backpack, some dry food and water. I felt exposed in the cabin, like the walls were too thin. I kept listening for any sound from outside, but there was nothing, just the wind again, and once in a while a bird calling from far away. When the sky turned dark blue and the forest became shadows, I lay down on the bed. The mattress felt uneven, pressing against my back in strange ways. I stared at the wooden ceiling, noticing the small cracks and the way some boards were darker from leaks. My body felt tired, but my mind stayed awake, going over the footprint, the drag marks, the open shed door. When the night settled and the cabin became cold, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. I felt trapped inside a small box surrounded by dark forest where anything could move unseen. Hours passed. The lantern dimmed. My breathing stayed soft and I tried to stay calm. But then I heard something, a dry snapping sound in the woods. Then another one, not loud but clear, close enough to make my skin tighten. I held my breath and listened. The snapping stopped. The silence came back, heavy and deep. I stared at the window, but it was too dark outside to see anything. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch falling or some animal moving around, but the sound did not feel like that. It was slow, sharp, almost deliberate. Minutes went by. Then I heard a faint, soft step, like weight pressing lightly on dry leaves. My heart pounded hard. I could feel it shaking inside my chest. I stayed frozen, staring at the window, waiting for another sound. Then the cabin wall made a small creak, as if something brushed against it or leaned lightly on it. My mouth went dry. I stayed still for a long time, listening to the silence that followed. The sound did not return, but the fear stayed, filling me with a feeling that someone was out there in the dark, close enough to touch the cabin walls. I didn't sleep that night. When the first pale light of morning came through the window, I got up slowly and stepped outside. The ground was cold and wet with the kind of dew that forms before sunrise. I checked the area around the cabin carefully. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then I saw the footprints, fresh ones. One set leading from the trees toward the cabin. One set leading back into the trees. They were deep and clear in the soft ground, like someone had walked through during the night. Someone had been here. I had been looking for a quiet place to get away from everything for a few days. My mind felt crowded after months of nonstop work, and the idea of being alone somewhere far away sounded comforting. I had found a small cabin listing through a local online forum. It was described as old but serviceable, located near the top of a forest ridge where there were no neighbors for a long distance. The listing mentioned the rough road, the weak cell signal, and the fact that the cabin had not been used since the previous winter, but it also said it was dry, safe, and stocked with basic supplies. I did not care much about comfort. I just wanted time alone, a place where I would not hear cars or people or anything except maybe the breeze and the trees. I packed light: clothes, food, a flashlight, a folding knife, and a battery pack for my phone. I left early in the morning so I could reach the cabin before sunset. The road to the ridge became narrower the higher I drove. At one point it was no longer a road but more like a single dirt track that twisted between trees, with deep tire ruts dried in the soil from past rain. My car shook as the wheels dropped into each dip. The forest around me grew thicker, taller, darker. Even though it was late afternoon, the branches overhead blocked a lot of the light. The air smelled heavy with pine sap and damp soil. I kept checking the map on my phone, but the signal became unstable. The icon froze for seconds at a time, which made me wonder if I had missed a turn. But then the map updated and showed I was still on the right path. The cabin finally appeared after a long stretch of climbing road. It stood on a small clearing of uneven ground with grass that had grown high, some of it leaning as if pushed by constant wind. The structure looked old but steady, made of thick logs darkened by weather and time. The roof slanted slightly to one side, and a metal chimney rose from it. The windows were small and dusty. The front door had scratches and faded paint. Beside the cabin was a wooden shed with a padlock on it. Behind everything, the land dropped sharply into the valley, giving a distant view of treetops stretched as far as my eyes could see. I parked a few steps from the cabin and felt a strange quiet. It was not peaceful the way I imagined. It felt too still, like the forest was watching me. I shook the feeling off, unloaded my bag, and unlocked the door. The key had been mailed to me earlier by the owner. The inside smelled like old wood, cold air, and dust. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a single bed with a firm mattress, and a wood stove. There were shelves with a few cans of food, matches, and an old oil lantern. The floorboards creaked under my feet. A small window on the far side showed the thick woods behind the cabin where the shadows were darker than the rest of the forest. I spent the next hour cleaning. Dust had settled everywhere, and spider webs clung to the corners. I swept the floor and wiped the surfaces with a cloth I had packed. When everything looked a little better, I placed my bag on the bed and sat down. The mattress made a stiff sound under my weight. I breathed slowly, trying to relax. I could hear the wind outside, brushing against the cabin walls. The sound passed through the wood like a faint murmur. I tried to enjoy it. I tried to let the silence sink in. But I kept feeling like the silence was not real silence. There was something else behind it, something barely noticeable, like a sense of pressure. Maybe it was just my mind reacting to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I reminded myself that nothing was wrong and that the cabin had been used many times. I heated a can of soup on the stove, ate slowly, and watched the sky turn from light to dark through the window. Night came quickly on the ridge. The trees outside became a black mass with almost no separation between individual trunks or branches. The wind grew stronger. The cabin made small popping sounds as if the wood was adjusting to the temperature. I lit the lantern because the electric light inside was very weak. The warm glow made the room feel a little more comfortable. Still, I kept feeling that something was off, even though I had no clear reason. It was the kind of feeling that builds in the background before you can explain it. I tried to push it away and told myself that it was just the unfamiliar environment. After finishing dinner, I stepped outside for a moment. The night air was colder, sharper. The stars were bright above the ridge, and the moonlight laid thin silver lines across the clearing. The forest seemed taller at night. The shadows beneath the trees were darker than anything inside the cabin. I stood still, listening. I thought I could hear something faint, distant rustling, uneven, not like the wind. It came from deeper inside the woods. Maybe an animal, maybe many animals. I had no reason to worry. I returned inside, locked the door, set the lantern on the table, and sat on the bed. My phone had almost no signal. I checked the time and decided to sleep early. I changed into warmer clothes, turned off the lantern, and lay down. The darkness in the cabin was thick. I could still hear the wind, but I could also hear the floor settling and distant cracking of branches outside. The sounds of nature did not scare me. What scared me was the quiet moments in between when I could hear nothing at all, as if the whole forest stopped breathing for a few seconds. I did not sleep well. I woke several times during the night for no clear reason. At one point I woke because of a thud outside, faint but sharp. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The wind kept blowing, but beneath it, I thought I heard slow steps in the grass. I told myself it was an animal, something like a deer or maybe a stray dog. I waited until the sound faded. When I tried to sleep again, my nerves were tight. When morning finally arrived, I felt heavy and tired, but seeing the sunlight helped. The cabin looked less threatening in daylight. I opened the door and took a long look at the clearing. The grass was bent in several places as if something had walked through during the night. The prints were irregular, not deep enough to identify, but long enough to show movement in different directions. I walked around the cabin slowly, studying the ground. I convinced myself that it could have been deer. The ridge had plenty of wildlife, the listing said. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed a narrow trail that led behind the cabin and into the woods. The trees back there grew so close that the trail looked like a crack between pillars. Fallen branches and roots covered most of the path. The soil was soft and damp. As I walked deeper, the light dimmed again, even though it was late morning. The forest had a dense, layered smell, old leaves, wet moss, and rotting wood. I walked for about 20 minutes before noticing something strange. The trees ahead had marks on them, long, shallow scrapes that ran down their bark in uneven lines. At first, I thought they were from a bear, but the marks did not look like claw marks. They were too straight, almost like something sharp had dragged down the surface. I looked at several trees, and the pattern repeated. Some marks looked older, faded, while others looked fresh. The air around me suddenly felt colder. I stood still, listening. I could not hear any animals. I could not hear birds either. The only sound came from the leaves brushing gently against each other high above me. I felt a tightness in my chest that I could not explain. I turned around slowly and followed the trail back to the cabin, looking over my shoulder several times. Back at the cabin, I sat at the table trying to shake off the anxiety. I kept telling myself the marks were probably from some forestry tool, maybe an old maintenance route. There was no real danger. I prepared lunch and tried to relax. But as the afternoon passed, the feeling of being watched slowly grew stronger. I would catch myself glancing at the windows, expecting to see movement. I would pause while eating because I thought I heard something outside, though I never saw anything. By evening, the wind died down, and the forest grew too quiet. I stepped out once more just before sunset. The air felt different, heavier again, like last night. The clearing seemed still, but the woods behind the cabin looked darker than they should for that time of day. It was as if the shadows were deepening faster than the sun was setting. I returned inside, locked the door, and tried to distract myself by reading something on my phone, but the signal was gone. I opened a book I had packed, but my mind kept drifting. I could not focus on any sentence. My ears tuned into every creak and shift the cabin made. Night fell, and with it came a feeling like something was moving outside. Not loud, not quick. Slow, wandering movement through the grass. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening. My heartbeat echoed in my chest. I felt every pulse. For long minutes, I heard nothing but my own breathing. Then, very faintly, I heard something brushing against the cabin wall from the outside. Soft, slow dragging, like fabric sliding across wood. My skin tightened. I did not move. I did not even swallow. The sound paused for a few seconds and then shifted to the other side of the cabin. I wanted to believe it was just the wind again, but the air outside was calm. I could feel the stillness. Whatever moved outside made deliberate steps. I waited for what felt like an hour, heart pounding, before the noise slowly faded away. I did not sleep that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to count the seconds until daylight. When morning finally came, the relief was immediate but shallow. I stepped outside again and checked the cabin walls. There were faint smudges on the wood that looked like something had rubbed or pressed against it, but nothing more. The grass around the cabin was bent again, this time in longer patterns that curved. The ground was too dry to show clear footprints, but I could see trails where something had moved in slow arcs. I considered leaving right then. The thought of packing and driving down the ridge crossed my mind several times, but a part of me felt embarrassed. I told myself I was overreacting. It was nature. Animals wandered at night. The forest was full of them. I forced myself to calm down and spent the day inside reading and trying to relax. But even during the day, I kept glancing at the windows, expecting something to pass by. Late in the afternoon, the light dimmed a little earlier than expected. Heavy clouds rolled over the ridge, bringing shadows with them. I sat on the bed, listening to the silence outside. I thought about the marks on the trees, the steps I heard, the smudges. Every time I tried to explain them away, a small part of my mind rejected those explanations. One thing stood out: the movement had been slow, not like a frightened or fast animal, It had been purposeful, wandering like someone walking around the cabin without a goal but with awareness. As night approached again, I felt a sense of dread rising in my stomach. The daylight was fading, and I felt trapped. The cabin was small and fragile. The woods held too many places for something or someone to stand and watch without being seen. I locked the door again, checked every window, and sat at the table with the lantern lit, staring at its flame. An hour passed, maybe two. The wind began again, but this time it was not steady. It came in low bursts, making the trees rustle unevenly. The cabin walls made tiny pops from the temperature dropping. I sat still, listening. Then came the sound, soft, steady steps in the grass outside. My chest tightened so hard I thought I would faint. The steps were slow, almost thoughtful. They moved from the front of the cabin toward the right side. I clenched my jaw and tried not to breathe loudly. The steps reached the right wall, paused, and then I heard the faintest dragging sound again, like something brushing against the wood. It lasted longer this time, slow from one end of the wall to the other. The lantern flickered slightly from a small current of cold air leaking through the logs. I stared at the wall, knowing something stood just a few inches away on the other side. After a long pause, the steps moved again. I followed the sound with my eyes as if that would help. They circled toward the back of the cabin. The back window was small and dusty. I avoided looking at it, afraid I might see a shape or a shadow. The steps stopped at the back wall. There was no sound for several seconds. Then there was a light tap against the wood. Then another, like someone pressing a finger or an object slowly, repeatedly. My whole body felt tight and frozen. The air inside the cabin felt stale, unchanging, as if waiting for something. The tapping grew a little louder, then stopped completely. Silence filled the cabin again. I waited. Every second felt like a long moment stretched until my nerves began to shake. I wanted the sound to continue so I would know where the thing was, but the silence meant it could have moved anywhere. Minutes passed, maybe longer. My ears strained for any noise. Slowly, the steps resumed. This time they moved toward the front of the cabin again. When they reached the front wall, they paused. Then I heard a sound that made my stomach drop, the faint metal sound of the doorknob shifting. Not turning fully, just a subtle testing pressure, like someone checking if it could move. The knob clicked slightly, then again. I stared at the door, my breath shallow. The lock held, but I felt a cold wave go through my body. The pressure on the knob stopped, and the steps moved away. I did not know what to do. I could not call anyone. No signal. I had no weapon other than a simple folding knife that would be useless against whatever circled the cabin with such slow confidence. I felt trapped in a wooden box surrounded by woods that hid whoever was out there. The steps faded into the distance, but I did not believe whoever it was had gone far. I sat at the table until the lantern oil burned low. Then I sat in darkness, listening, waiting. I did not sleep at all that night. When morning came, I made my decision. I would pack and leave immediately. I stepped outside to load my car, but when I moved toward the driver's side, I noticed something that made my hands go cold. On the thin layer of dust covering the car door, there were marks. Long, clear, deliberate streaks, as if someone had dragged their fingers across the surface. Not quick smudges. Slow, uneven lines spaced in a way that looked too wide for a normal hand. My throat tightened. I did not want to think about what that meant. I packed faster, throwing everything into the back seat without caring about order. As I moved around the cabin one last time to make sure I had not forgotten anything, I noticed fresh grass depressions near the back window. Long, narrow paths where something had stood for a while. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound of the engine felt too loud in the quiet clearing, almost like it disturbed something that preferred silence. I pulled out as quickly as the rough track allowed, the wheels bumping and sliding over uneven ground. As I drove down the ridge, I kept checking the mirrors. Every shadow between trees made my chest tighten. It felt like something could appear behind me at any moment. The dense trunks made the daylight flicker as if something moved between them. It took a long time to reach the main road. When I finally saw the wider path, my body loosened, but only a little. I drove faster until the forest around me thinned and gave way to open land and clear sky. I did not stop until I reached the nearest town. I parked in a public area, stepped out, and just stood there, breathing heavily. The normal sounds of cars, people, and distant machinery felt unreal but comforting. I stayed there for a long time before getting back in the car and driving home. For days afterward, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. At night, I kept checking the locks and looking outside my window even though I lived in a busy neighborhood far from any woods. The silence of the ridge still echoed in my mind. The slow steps, the brushing against the cabin walls, the tapping, and the pressure on the doorknob haunted me more than any scream or sudden noise ever could. What scared me the most was the deliberate way whoever was out there moved. The slow, patient, unhurried steps, the careful testing of the doorknob, the way they circled the cabin the same way both nights, as if they were studying the place, as if they were studying me. I never contacted the cabin owner. I never explained why I left early. I did not want to talk about it. I did not want anyone to ask questions I did not want to answer. I do not know who or what was out there. I only know one thing with absolute clarity, something that repeats in my mind whenever I remember the ridge. If I had stayed one more night, I am certain that whoever circled the cabin would not have just tested the door again. They would have opened it, and I would not be here to write this. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon. After a long drive through empty roads that ran between hills and tall trees that seemed to grow closer together the deeper I went. The place had been listed online as a small, private cabin meant for people who wanted a quiet weekend away from noise. I had wanted that silence for months. My life felt packed with pressure, constant messages, constant movement, and I thought a place like this would let my mind settle for a while. I had imagined soft mornings, slow days, and calm nights, with nothing around me but wind and trees. I had no idea that the silence here would feel nothing like comfort after the first night. The cabin sat at the end of a long dirt road that curved through a patch of woods so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground in the late afternoon. The building itself looked older than the pictures online. The wooden boards were worn out, the railing on the small front porch looked like it could break under pressure, and the windows looked dusty. Still, I told myself that old places usually had character. I parked my car beside a large pine tree that leaned slightly toward the cabin. When I stepped out of the car, the air felt colder than I expected. It carried that sharp, almost metallic smell that comes from dense trees and dry earth. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked toward the front door. The ground felt uneven under my shoes, like there were roots pushing upward beneath the soil. When I reached the door, I noticed scratch marks on the wood, thin and long, as if someone had dragged something sharp along the surface over and over again. I told myself it was probably from animals, maybe a raccoon or something similar. I tried not to think too much about it. Inside, the cabin had a simple layout. The living area was small, with an old sofa, a wooden table, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used for years. Dust coated the stones around it. There was a small kitchen in one corner, with a narrow counter and a single window that faced the forest behind the cabin. The air inside felt stale, like the place had been closed for a very long time. The bedroom was in the back, with a single bed covered in a faded blanket. The sheets smelled old, so I replaced them with the clean ones I had brought. After settling in, I walked around the property just to get a sense of the surroundings. The cabin sat in a small clearing, but the trees around it stood tall and tight, like walls. There was a faint trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The path looked like it hadn't been used in years, overgrown and covered in fallen branches. The silence in those woods felt heavy. It was the kind of silence where even your own footsteps felt too loud. I didn't like how it made me feel, so I went back inside. By the time evening came, the cabin felt colder, and I had to keep my jacket on even inside. I made a simple meal, cleaned up, and sat on the sofa as the light outside faded. With no TV and spotty phone service, there wasn't much to do. I listened to the wind outside, which came in slow waves, making the trees sway and creak. The sound settled into a rhythm that should have been calming, but something about it made me uneasy. It felt like something else was moving along with the wind, something irregular, something heavy. When I went to bed, the woods outside were pitch black. There was no moonlight, no distant street lamps, nothing. Just complete darkness pressing against the windows. I lay in bed for a long time, listening. Every small sound felt sharper in that silence. The creaking of the walls, the subtle pops from the wooden floor, even the faint rustling of leaves outside. All of it felt too close. At some point during the night, when I was somewhere between awake and asleep, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, uneven, and too heavy to belong to an animal. They circled the cabin once, then again, and then stopped right outside my bedroom window. I stayed completely still. My breathing became shallow, and my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to convince myself it was some large animal, maybe a deer walking strangely, but the pattern of the steps felt too deliberate, too slow, too controlled. The steps stayed near the window for a long time, and I lay there frozen, unable to move, staring at the ceiling with cold sweat covering my skin. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything after the steps stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The quiet locked me in place until I finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep without realizing it. In the morning, I felt exhausted. My body felt heavy, and my head hurt from lack of proper rest. When I walked outside, the air felt colder than the previous day. I stepped around to the side of the cabin near the bedroom window. The dirt there looked disturbed. There were footprints, clear enough to see where the heel and front of the shoe had pressed into the ground. They weren't from heavy boots or anything thick. They looked like normal shoes, human shoes. The prints circled the cabin exactly the way I had heard them the night before. My stomach tightened. A cold feeling ran through me, stronger than the morning breeze. I immediately looked at the tree line, scanning for movement, but everything stood still. The woods looked calm and empty. Not a single sound came from them. Even birds were silent. I didn't know if I should leave right then or try to check if anyone else was supposed to be nearby. The listing for the cabin had claimed the nearest house was miles away. But after seeing those prints, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the cabin long before I arrived. I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on normal things. I cleaned the kitchen, organized my bag, and walked around inside the cabin just to stay moving. Every time I approached a window, I had the sense that someone was standing just out of sight. The air inside felt colder than outside, as if the walls were holding something in. Around noon, I walked outside again to get some fresh air. I followed the edge of the clearing, keeping my eyes on the trees. I noticed something strange behind the cabin, just before the forest started. A piece of white cloth hung from one of the branches, torn and dirty. When I walked closer, I realized it was part of a shirt sleeve, stuck on a broken branch. It looked fairly fresh, like the tear had happened recently. The cloth still had sharp edges and hadn't been worn down by weather. I felt a deep, uneasy pressure in my chest. I started scanning the forest again, feeling that heavy silence sitting over everything like a thick layer. Even the wind seemed weaker behind the cabin, as if the trees were blocking it out. The rest of the day crawled by. I tried reading a book, but my mind kept drifting back to the footprints, the footsteps, and the torn cloth. Every time the wind pushed the branches or made the cabin creak, my body tensed. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered overhead, making the forest look even darker. When evening arrived, the air felt heavier, almost humid. I didn't feel hungry, but I forced myself to eat something small. The sky turned dark quickly, and soon the only light inside the cabin came from the single lamp near the sofa. I didn't want to go to bed too early, worried that the same thing would happen again. I sat on the sofa with my back to the wall so I could see every part of the room. Hours passed like that. When I finally stood up to go to the bathroom, I glanced at the front window and froze. The dirt path that led toward the deeper woods had a dark shape lying across it, something long and still. My body turned cold. I stepped closer to the window, trying to understand what I was looking at. It was a fallen tree branch, a large one, but it hadn't been there earlier. I was sure of it. I had walked outside before the sun went down, and the ground was clear. Something or someone had dragged it there. I stayed awake for as long as I could, but eventually exhaustion forced me to go to the bedroom. I kept the lamp in the living room on, hoping the light would spill enough brightness down the hallway to keep my nerves steady. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the faint glow on the ceiling. My body felt stiff, as if every muscle had been pulled tight. Hours later, deep in the night, the sounds returned. But this time it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing right outside the bedroom window. Not the breathing of someone tired, not the breathing of someone moving. It was the breathing of someone standing still, close enough that I could almost feel the vibration through the wall. My heart pounded so violently I felt dizzy. I couldn't move. The breathing stayed for what felt like minutes, maybe longer. It never sped up, never slowed down. Then something brushed the window. A faint scraping sound, steady and slow. Not claws, not branches. Something that slid along the glass like a fingertip or the edge of something dull. It moved across the window once, then again. I stayed frozen until the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. I waited until the first light of morning appeared through the trees before I finally got out of bed. The moment I stepped outside, I saw footprints again, much clearer this time. They were right beneath the bedroom window. The ground there had slightly softer dirt, so the prints were deep and easy to see. They faced the cabin directly, like the person had stood there for a long time. I realized something else then. The prints weren't from the same person as the night before. The size was different, slightly smaller this time. There were two different sets. One from the first night, one from the second. Two people, or at least two separate visits. My breath turned shaky. I looked around at the trees, feeling the cold air brush against my face. The forest felt even denser now, like the trees had moved closer overnight. I knew I couldn't stay long. My mind raced as I packed. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't clean the dishes. I barely checked the bedroom before leaving. I threw everything into my bag and walked out to the car as quickly as possible. I didn't run, but I moved fast enough that my steps felt rushed and uneven. When I reached the car and opened the driver's door, something caught my eye. On the back of the car, someone had pressed their hand against the dust on the trunk. A clear handprint, larger than mine. The fingers were long, and the palm was wide. It wasn't smudged or distorted. It looked fresh, like it had been placed there early that morning. That was the moment something inside me broke. I got into the car, closed the door, and locked it immediately. My hands shook as I put the key into the ignition. The engine started, and I backed out quickly, leaving the clearing behind as fast as the uneven road allowed. But the road out of the forest was long, narrow, and twisted. The trees on both sides stood so close that the car barely fit through some areas. Every turn made my heart tighten, because I kept imagining someone stepping out from behind a tree. Halfway down the road, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. Something darted behind one of the trees, too fast for me to see clearly. My heart skipped. I pressed the gas harder. The car bounced over rocks and dips, but I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes forward, focusing only on the thin path ahead. When I finally reached the paved road, the tension in my chest eased only slightly. I drove until I reached the nearest gas station miles away. I parked under the bright lights, the kind that made everything look clear and sharp. Only then did I feel like I could breathe properly again. But even in that parking lot, something didn't feel right. The handprint on my trunk was still there. The dust still held the shape perfectly. I stared at it for a long time before wiping it away with my shaking hand. I got back into the car and sat there for a long while, feeling the weight of everything catch up to me. The footsteps, the breathing, the prints, the torn cloth, the branch dragged across the ground, the handprint on the car. None of it felt random. Someone had been around that cabin before I arrived. Someone had been watching it, and someone had come back while I was inside. Maybe they lived in the woods. Maybe they used the cabin when no one rented it. Maybe they waited for visitors. I don't know. I drove home that day without stopping again. When I finally walked into my house, I felt safer, but that safety didn't feel complete. It felt thin, like a fragile layer that could break at any moment. Over the next few days, I kept checking the locks on my doors. Every small sound made my body tense. I kept thinking about the two sets of prints, how different they looked, how one set stayed near the window for so long. I wondered if they had watched through the glass. I wondered how long they had been there before I woke up. I never reported anything. I don't know why. Maybe I thought no one would believe me because nothing directly happened. Maybe I just wanted to forget the whole thing. But the truth is, I still think about it almost every night. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. The breathing never turned into someone trying to break in. The footsteps never turned into running. The handprint never turned into someone appearing in the woods while I watched. It all felt like I had left right before something worse was supposed to happen. The last thing that keeps me awake sometimes is one simple thought. If there were two sets of footprints, where was the second person on the first night? Did they both watch me? Or was one already inside the woods, watching me long before I heard the first step? I went to the small cabin because I wanted a break from everything. My work had drained me for months, and I kept telling myself that a few quiet days away from the city would give me some space to breathe. I booked the cabin online after reading a few reviews. Most people said it was peaceful, simple, and in a quiet part of the woods where you could hear yourself think. That was all I needed. I didn't care about luxury. I just wanted silence and time away from humans. The cabin was a small wooden place sitting at the end of a narrow gravel road. The road curved around trees, and every time I turned the wheel, dust lifted behind me and slowly faded into the warm afternoon light. It took me nearly 3 hours to get there from my home, and during the last 30 minutes, I started to feel something in my stomach, like a slow tightening. It wasn't fear, but it was a strange mix of excitement and uneasiness. I told myself it was just because of the isolation. I had not been this far out in a long time. When I reached the cabin, I stepped out of my car, stretched my legs, and took a moment to look around. Tall pine trees surrounded everything. The cabin was small but clean. There was a small porch, 2 windows in the front, and a wooden door that had probably been replaced not long ago because it looked newer than the rest of the place. The forest smelled like damp soil and pine needles. I liked that smell. It made me feel grounded. I carried my bags inside. The inside of the cabin was very simple. A small kitchen on one side, a single bed pushed against the wall, a small table, a little shelf that had some old books left by previous guests. The bathroom was tiny, but at least it worked. I was happy with everything. It wasn't fancy, but I wasn't expecting anything fancy anyway. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I wanted to get out of my head for a while. After unpacking, I went outside and sat on the porch with a bottle of water. The afternoon air was warm, and the shadows from the trees slowly stretched across the dirt ground outside the cabin. I didn't hear any birds. That surprised me. Usually, woods like these were full of birds, even late in the day. But the silence didn't feel threatening. It just felt strange. I stayed outside until the sky turned orange. Then I went back inside, cooked myself something simple, and ate while sitting on the small bed. I kept the door locked because I kept remembering how isolated the place was. I didn't like unlocked doors in the middle of nowhere. After eating, I cleaned up, stretched a bit, and lay down. I didn't plan to sleep that early, but the silence and the long drive made my eyes heavy. I must have slept for a few hours when something woke me. At first, I didn't know what it was. It felt like a vibration at the edge of my awareness. I lay there in the darkness, breathing slowly, listening. Then I understood what the sound was. It was the sound of an engine, a vehicle. It was far away but slowly getting closer. My heart picked up without my permission. I wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody knew I was here except the owner of the rental listing. The engine sound got louder. I sat up on the bed. The cabin had no curtains, only thin blinds. I didn't want to lift them because I didn't want whoever was outside to see movement from inside the cabin. I stayed still and listened. The engine was deep. It sounded like a heavy truck, the kind that old farms used. It wasn't a normal visitor car or anything like that. The truck slowed down. I felt the vibrations under the wooden floor. Then the engine stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the silence earlier in the day. My ears strained for footsteps, but I heard nothing. No door opening. No gravel crunching. Nothing. I waited. My breathing was slow and controlled, even though my chest felt tight. After a few minutes of complete stillness, the engine started again. It rumbled for a short moment, then faded into the distance until I couldn't hear it anymore. I stayed awake for almost an hour after that, listening, waiting for it to come back. It never did. Eventually, my tiredness caught up with me, and even though I didn't fully relax, I fell asleep again. The next morning, the truck incident felt unreal. It was like something that happened in a dream, even though I knew it wasn't a dream. The dirt road outside the cabin had tire marks, but they were mixed with older ones, so I couldn't tell exactly when they were made. I made breakfast and tried not to think about it too much. Maybe it was just some old neighbor who used the road regularly. Maybe someone got lost. Maybe it wasn't a big deal. I tried to convince myself, but something in me was alert now, like my instincts were awake and watching. I spent the day walking near the cabin, exploring the woods a little but not too deep. I didn't want to get lost. The trees were tall, and the ground was full of roots, leaves, and small rocks that shifted under every step. Sometimes I stopped and listened. I kept expecting to hear something behind me, but there was nothing except the soft rustle of leaves when the wind passed through. I walked far enough to find a small creek and sat beside it. The water was cold and clear. The air felt nice against my skin. Being near water usually made me feel peaceful, but even then, I felt a quiet pressure in the back of my mind, like something was waiting for me back at the cabin. When I returned, the cabin looked exactly the same. Nothing had changed. I tried to relax again, but something in me didn't want to fully settle. The second night was when everything started to shift into something I couldn't explain away. I went to bed early again because there wasn't much to do. I kept the lights low and made sure the door was locked twice. I lay on the bed staring at the wooden ceiling boards. At some point, my eyes closed without me noticing. The sound woke me again. The same engine. This time I sat up instantly. The truck sounded closer this time, but slower, like it was moving carefully. I could feel each low vibration through the floor again. I stayed completely still. The truck stopped right outside the cabin. I didn't move. My breathing felt sharp inside my chest. I waited to hear a door open, footsteps, something. But the same quiet spread again, heavy and thick. Minutes passed. Then, very slowly, the truck drove away again. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until sunrise, listening to every small noise inside and outside the cabin. I checked the windows once it was bright enough. Through the blinds, I saw fresh tire marks on the dirt. Someone had stopped right in front of the cabin. I started to think maybe someone was watching the cabin. Maybe someone was checking if it was empty. Maybe they didn't expect anyone to be inside. Every explanation I came up with brought a new worry. What if it was someone who didn't want anyone here? What if I was in the wrong place at the wrong time? The day passed slowly. I tried to distract myself by reading one of the old books on the shelf, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound outside made me look up. Every shadow between the trees made my shoulders tighten. I thought about leaving early, but I didn't want to pack up while feeling panicked. I told myself I would leave the next morning. That gave me time to rest and prepare. But deep down, I didn't believe I would rest at all. When night came, I didn't turn off the lights completely. I left the small lamp on near the bed because I wanted to see the room clearly if something happened. I lay under the blanket, staring at the door. It was locked. I checked it again before lying down. Sleep pulled at me but never fully took me. My body felt heavy but my mind stayed awake. It returned again, but this time it didn't stop at the cabin. The truck came slower than the night before. The engine hummed through the ground and climbed into my bones. I listened without moving. It felt like my heartbeat was trying to match the rhythm of the engine. Then the truck stopped somewhere behind the cabin. Not in front, behind. The ground behind the cabin was softer. Pine needles covered it. The tires made a different kind of sound there, a muffled crunch. The truck idled for a moment. Then the engine cut off. Silence. A new kind of silence. A silence with weight. I didn't hear the truck door open. I didn't hear footsteps. Nothing moved. Not even the wind. It was like the whole forest held its breath. Minutes crawled by. My mind started imagining the worst possibilities. Someone standing behind the cabin. Someone watching from the tree line. Someone waiting for me to come out. Someone planning something that I didn't want to even think about. After what felt like an hour, the engine started again. It sounded slow, almost hesitant. The truck moved away, circling the cabin, crunching sticks and pine needles softly under its wheels. Then it returned to the main dirt road and rumbled away until the sound disappeared completely. I didn't sleep that night either. I stayed sitting on the bed with my back against the wall, staring at the door, staring at the windows, staring at the shadowed corners of the room until the sun finally touched the trees. The moment the light filled the cabin, I made a decision. I was leaving. I didn't care how early it was. I didn't care if I left half my things behind. I just wanted to get out of there. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into my bags without folding anything. I threw the bags into my car and ran back to lock the cabin door again out of pure instinct, even though I wasn't staying anymore. Before leaving, I walked around the back of the cabin to check the ground. I needed to see something with my own eyes. The tire marks were deep, pressed into the pine needles. Whoever was driving that truck had stopped only a few feet from the back wall of the cabin. The marks were fresh. The air behind the cabin was cold, colder than the front. I didn't know if that was because sunlight had not reached there yet or because my body was reacting to the feeling that something had been standing there watching the cabin. I didn't wait any longer. I got into my car, turned the engine on, and drove down the gravel road. My hands were tight around the steering wheel, and my eyes kept flicking to the mirrors. I expected the truck to appear behind me at any moment. Didn't, but I didn't feel relieved. Not even a little. The gravel road felt 10 times longer on the way out. Every tree looked like it was hiding something. Every branch that moved made my chest tighten. When I finally reached the main paved road, I took a deep breath, but it didn't help. My shoulders felt like stones. I drove for almost an hour before stopping at a gas station. I needed to breathe and calm down. I parked under the bright lights near the entrance. Seeing people walk in and out of the store made me feel safer. The normal world felt so far from the cabin that my mind struggled to adjust. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring through the windshield at nothing. Then I noticed something in my side mirror. Pine needles. They were stuck in the small crack between the trunk and the body of my car. I hadn't driven through any needles when leaving the cabin. My car was parked on bare dirt in the front. The pine needles in the back made no sense. Unless someone had walked behind my car early that morning before I woke up. Unless someone had gotten close enough to touch it. The thought made my stomach twist. I brushed the needles off with my hand, but the feeling stayed. A small detail, but it connected everything in a way I didn't like. The truck stopping behind the cabin. The silence. The feeling of being watched. The fresh tire marks. I didn't go back home right away. I drove around for a while because I didn't want to go somewhere predictable. I didn't want to go straight to the place where I lived. I was scared that maybe the truck had followed me without me noticing. Every dark SUV in traffic made my heart jump. Every pickup truck in my mirror made my mouth dry. Eventually, after enough driving and enough time, I went home. I closed all the curtains. I locked the doors. I checked them twice. My mind replayed everything. Every noise, every vibration, every moment of silence. I kept telling myself that maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was someone who lived nearby. Maybe they were checking their land. Maybe I was overreacting. But the feeling never left. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tire marks behind the cabin again. I heard the engine idling in the dark. I felt the weight of that silence pressing against the wooden walls. The next morning, I checked outside my house before leaving for work. I looked at the street carefully. No trucks, no strange cars, nothing out of place. Days passed. I tried to forget about the cabin. I tried to let the memory fade, but something in me stayed alert like a small alarm that never fully shut off. A week later, it happened. I was coming home from work, tired and ready to shower and sleep early. I turned onto my street slowly, letting my mind drift. Then I saw it, parked halfway down the street. A dark pickup truck, old, heavy, the same shape, the same height, the same faded color. It was sitting there quietly, facing the opposite direction, like it was waiting for something or someone. My heart dropped. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove past it while pretending not to notice. My fingers hurt from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. When I parked in front of my house and looked in the mirror again, the truck was gone. Completely gone. No sound, no trail, no fading engine noise, like it had only been there long enough for me to see it. That was the moment I understood something clearly. Whatever or whoever was behind that truck had not stopped watching when I left the cabin. Leaving the woods didn't end it. Coming home didn't end it. It simply moved the problem from the cabin to my life. And the cabin, the woods, the nights, the silence. None of it was the scary part anymore. The scary part was knowing that whoever was behind that truck knew where I lived now. Whoever had stopped behind the cabin in the dark knew where to find me. Whoever had walked close enough to my car to leave pine needles stuck inside its trunk gap was still out there. Still watching. Still returning. And I had no idea when the engine would start again in the quiet of the night. Or where it would stop next. Or how close it would come. I only knew one thing with complete clarity. The cabin was not the mistake. Leaving it was not the mistake. Staying alone in the woods was not the mistake. The mistake was thinking that the truck only belonged to that place. Because it didn't. It belonged to someone. Someone with a reason. Someone who had chosen the cabin before me. Someone who was not finished. And now, the place I used to call my home had become the new cabin. A place where the silence felt heavy. A place where engines meant danger. A place where I slept lightly every night, waiting for that sound to return. And deep down, I know that one night it will. The engine will hum again. It will slow down. It will stop. This time not at a cabin in the woods, but right outside my house. And the silence after that will tell me everything I need to know. That this time, whoever is inside the truck will not drive away. They will come for the reason they kept returning. And when that moment comes, it will be the end of the story for me. Not because I didn't see it coming, but because I knew from the very first night at the cabin that something had already chosen me long before I ever heard that engine for the first time. I went to the cabin because I wanted silence. I felt like the noise in my life had been pressing against my head for too long, making everything around me feel tight and crowded. The cabin was in a remote part of the mountains, far from roads, far from cities, and far from anyone who might try to interrupt me. I had been there before with friends years ago, but this time I went alone because I wanted to feel the forest without anyone near me. I wanted the cold air, the sound of the river in the distance, and the thick smell of pine that hung around the slopes like a heavy blanket. When I arrived, the sun was already low behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt path leading to the cabin. I remember feeling a strange calm as I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and breathed in the cool, stale air that had been trapped inside for months. Dust floated in the gray light coming through the window, and everything looked untouched. I put my bags down and walked around the cabin. It wasn't big, just one main room with an old wood stove, a table, a chair, a bed pushed up against the wall, and a small counter with a metal sink that only worked when the generator was running. There was a little door in the corner that led to a bathroom with a bucket toilet and a small basin. Everything felt the same as I remembered it. The wooden walls still had old scratches in them from when previous owners dragged furniture around. The floor still creaked in the same spots. The windows still rattled when the wind pushed against them. I felt safe at first, or at least I felt like the cabin was holding itself together the way it always had. I didn't notice anything strange. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel nervous or unsettled. I just felt tired from the long hike and ready to settle in. I went outside and looked around the clearing. It was quiet except for the wind in the branches. The trees around the cabin were tall and thick, and their trunks were dark and rough. The ground was covered in pine needles and dead leaves, and there were old broken branches scattered around. The forest looked deep, much deeper than I had remembered, stretching endlessly in every direction. The air felt colder than it had earlier, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around me. As I stood there, the silence grew heavier, and I realized how far away I was from anything familiar. I could feel the distance, real distance, not just in miles but in the way the forest absorbed sound. Everything felt muted. Even my footsteps sounded dull. When I went back inside the cabin, I unpacked my food, my clothes, and the few tools I brought. I stored my dry food in a wooden cabinet next to the counter and set my water containers near the bed. I unrolled my sleeping bag and placed it on top of the old mattress. The air was getting colder, so I gathered firewood from the pile outside and started a small fire in the stove. The warmth filled the room slowly, and the metal stove clicked as it expanded. I watched the small flames move and felt the tension in my shoulders loosen. I thought that the next few days would be calm and simple, but something started to bother me not long after I settled in. It was small at first, something I didn't pay attention to until later. When I looked at the window from inside the cabin, I felt like the trees were closer than they had been when I stood outside earlier. I couldn't explain it. The branches seemed to press in toward the glass, as if the forest was crowding up against the cabin. I thought maybe I was imagining it because the sky was dimming and the shadows were changing. But I remember standing by the window and staring at the tree line, feeling uncertain. The branches looked like they had moved somehow, like the forest had drawn itself inward. I stepped back, shook the thought away, and decided not to focus on it. As the night grew darker, I made myself something small to eat, then sat on the edge of the bed. The fire in the stove crackled quietly. I listened to the wind outside and the occasional rustling of leaves. The temperature dropped a little more, so I added a few logs to the stove. I felt tired but not sleepy. The quiet outside made my thoughts sharper, like each sound took up more space in my head. The more I listened, the more I realized how empty everything was. It wasn't peaceful quiet. It was heavy quiet, the kind that made you feel like the world had shrunk down to only what you could see and touch. At some point, I walked to the window again and looked outside. The darkness felt thicker now. The trees looked like they were pressed against each other, forming a solid black wall around the clearing. The branches swayed gently in the wind, but the movements felt slow, almost too slow, as if the forest was breathing in long, steady breaths. I kept my eyes on the tree line, waiting for something to move or shift. I didn't know why I felt like that, but something inside me made me stare. After a few minutes, I finally pulled myself away from the window and lay down on the bed. I tried to sleep, but every small sound made me open my eyes. I could hear the wood stove crackling, a faint tapping sound from outside as branches moved, and the soft creaking of the cabin settling. I told myself that everything was normal, that the cabin had always made these noises, but the longer I lay there, the more my mind picked at the sounds. I felt like something was different, something was off in a way I couldn't describe. It took a long time for sleep to come. When it did, it was thin and restless. I kept waking up to every little noise, my mind reacting before my body could relax. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't lost in anything. I was just sinking into short stretches of half sleep, then rising back to awareness with each crack or faint rustle outside. At one point, I heard what sounded like a slow dragging sound somewhere near the back wall of the cabin. It was very faint, so faint I thought maybe it was just the wind moving something along the ground. But the sound wasn't smooth like wind-driven movement. It felt deliberate, steady, and slow. I didn't get up. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting the sound crawl across my nerves until it stopped. After that, I stayed awake for a long time before sleep finally pulled me under. When I opened my eyes again, the cabin was pale with early light. The fire in the stove had died down to faint red coals. The air was cold, and my breath hung in a thin cloud above me. I sat up slowly, rubbing the tiredness out of my face. My body felt stiff from the restless night. I stood up, stretched, and walked to the stove to warm my hands. The coals glowed dimly, and I stirred them with a metal rod. I added a small log, then watched the flames grow. As I warmed up, I looked around the cabin. Everything seemed ordinary again. The wooden walls were the same. The windows were fogged from the cold morning air. My gear was exactly where I left it. Nothing was moved, nothing was strange. I felt a little foolish for how tense I had been the night before. A long day of hiking and the silence of the forest probably made me more alert than usual. That was all. I put on my boots and stepped outside. The air was crisp and sharp. Frost clung to the grass near the edges of the clearing, and the ground felt firm under my feet. I walked slowly around the cabin, letting my eyes adjust to the brightening sky. The forest looked normal again. The trees didn't feel close or pressing against the clearing. They stood tall and still, their branches moving gently with the morning wind. The strange feeling from the night seemed far away now, like something imagined. I walked along the edge of the clearing to look for any tracks or signs of animals that might have caused the dragging sound I heard. I expected to see marks in the dirt or disturbed leaves, but the ground looked untouched. The pine needles were smooth, undisturbed. The frost on the ground had no breaks or lines. It looked like nothing had moved through the area at all. I stared at the ground for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I had heard something. I was sure of it. But now there was no sign of anything. I walked farther along the edge, circling the cabin slowly. When I reached the back wall, where I thought the sound came from, I crouched down and brushed my hand over the ground. Everything looked normal. I even checked the wooden wall itself for any marks or scratches, but the old weathered wood showed nothing new. The calm of the morning slowly settled into me as I gave up searching and stood back up. I walked to the small path leading into the woods and followed it for a while. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating long stripes on the forest floor. The cool air felt good as I breathed it in. I walked until the cabin was out of sight, then kept going until I reached a small ridge that overlooked a narrow valley. Everything looked peaceful. The trees down below were a dark green blanket stretching across the land. I stood there for a long time, feeling the quiet sink into me in a better way than it had the night before. After a while, I headed back to the cabin. I made breakfast, cleaned up a bit, and decided to gather more firewood before the sun got too low. The day passed calmly, without anything strange. The uneasiness I felt the night before faded into something small and distant. But things would shift again when the sun began to go down. I went to the cabin at the start of October because I wanted quiet. My mind had been tired for months. Life in the city had felt loud in a way I could not turn off. Even simple things like cars moving outside my window or people talking in the hallway of my apartment building made me feel like something was pressing on my chest. I thought a week alone in the mountains would help me breathe again. I had stayed in that cabin many times before, and nothing bad had ever happened. It was small and old, but it sat in a quiet valley where the trees blocked the wind, and the closest neighbor lived several miles away. I knew the land well. I knew the trails that ran around the cabin and where they led, and I had never seen anything out of place in all the years I had been going there. It was a safe place to me. When I arrived, the air felt colder than I expected. It was the kind of cold that made the skin on my hands feel tight. The trees around the cabin were turning yellow, and dry leaves covered the ground in a thick layer that made soft crackling sounds under my boots. I remember standing outside the cabin door for a moment before going in, just listening to the silence. It was the kind of silence you never get in the city. It almost felt heavy. It made the cabin seem even more isolated than I remembered. Inside, everything looked the same as always. The furniture was old but clean. The kitchen smelled like old wood and dust. The bed was in the corner, and the small table was still next to the window. I unpacked slowly to settle in, then walked the property to check around like I always did. I looked at the firewood pile behind the cabin, the small tool shed, the muddy area near the creek where animals sometimes passed through. Everything looked normal except for one thing. The grass behind the shed was flattened in a way that looked recent. It was shaped more like someone had been sitting or crouching there rather than an animal lying down. I noticed it but ignored it, thinking maybe a deer or something had pressed itself there overnight. I didn't worry about it. The first night was quiet. I cooked simple food on the small stove, wrote in my notebook for a bit, and then went outside for air. The night sky looked clear, and the moon made the trees glow a pale white. The forest was cold and still. I stayed out there only a few minutes because the air made my fingers hurt. When I went back inside, I locked the door, turned off the lights, and lay in bed. It took me a long time to fall asleep, not because I felt scared, but because I was so used to city noise. Silence made my mind too aware of everything, especially the faint shaking sound the cabin made when the wind pushed on it. I finally slept. I woke up early the next morning with a strange feeling in my stomach. I could not explain it. It wasn't fear. It felt more like I had forgotten something important or left something undone. I tried to ignore it and went outside to breathe the cold air. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed the area behind the shed again. The flattened grass was worse than the day before. The leaves were pushed aside in a clear shape, almost like someone had been lying there at night. I crouched down to look closer and saw a small piece of torn fabric caught on a nail sticking out from the shed wall. It looked like it came from a dark jacket. That was when the feeling in my stomach got worse. I stood up and looked around the trees, but everything was still. No sound at all except the wind moving the higher branches. I tried to stay calm and told myself it could have been left by a hunter or hiker passing through, even though I knew nobody usually came this way. The closest marked trail was far from the cabin, and the land around it was private property. People did not wander here on accident. I spent the afternoon hiking the area around the cabin to settle my mind. The forest looked normal. Birds moved through the trees, and dry leaves fell with soft cracking sounds. At one point, I thought I saw movement far between the trees, but when I looked again, nothing was there. I convinced myself it was just a branch falling or an animal running off before I saw it. But as I walked back toward the cabin, I felt something new. I felt like someone had been watching me all day. It wasn't a sharp fear, more like a slow pressure growing in the back of my mind. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I couldn't see anything. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was going down. The sky looked orange and purple, and long shadows stretched across the ground. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There were faint footprints on the dry leaves near the steps, footprints bigger than mine. They looked fresh, pressed sharply into the layer of leaves and dirt. I looked at them for a long time, trying to make sense of them. They led toward the porch, but not away from it, like someone had walked up to the cabin and then stopped. I checked the door. It was still locked. I checked the windows, all closed. It made no sense. That night, I could not relax. I sat inside with the lights off, listening to the noises outside. The forest had more sound than the night before. Small cracks, soft scraping noises far away. I pressed my back against the wall near the window and tried to listen carefully. At one point, I thought I heard slow steps on the leaves near the shed, but I told myself it was just an animal. I felt tired but refused to sleep for hours. I only fell asleep when my body couldn't fight it anymore. In the morning, I walked outside again, even though I felt nervous. The cold air hit my face, and the first thing I checked was the area behind the shed. My stomach dropped when I saw it. The flattened area was bigger, and this time, there were marks in the dirt that looked like knee prints, like someone had been kneeling there for a long time. I stepped around it slowly, trying not to disturb anything, and I saw something else. A small pile of tiny bones not far from the shed. They looked like the bones of a squirrel or small bird. They were clean, no flesh left on them. They were placed in a neat little pile on top of a flat rock. I stared at it for a long time because something about the way they were arranged made me feel sick. It wasn't natural for bones to be stacked so neatly. It looked like someone had done it with focus, maybe even care. I felt cold, even though the sun was rising. I walked around the property trying to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched kept growing. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like someone was out there, standing still, waiting. Every time I looked toward the trees, I felt like I had just missed seeing something. The next thing happened late that afternoon. I was inside the cabin drying off near the stove after washing up at the creek when I heard a dull thump outside. It sounded like it came from the porch. My whole body froze. I moved quietly to the small window by the door and looked out through a crack in the curtain. First, I saw nothing. The porch looked empty. Then I looked down. There was a rock sitting there that had not been there before. A round, smooth rock placed carefully in the center of the porch. I stared at it for a long time, my heart beating faster with every second. I didn't open the door. I didn't want to. I backed away slowly and sat in the corner of the cabin where I could see the door. For hours, I didn't move. Even when it got dark, I stayed in the same spot. The forest made more noise than usual that night. I kept hearing single, sharp cracks like someone stepping on sticks. Not walking, just stepping. One step. Wait, another step. I held my breath every time. The noises came from different directions around the cabin, slow and irregular. It made me think someone was circling the property in the dark, moving carefully. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I opened the door slowly and looked at the porch. The rock was still there. The footprints around the steps looked deeper and more chaotic now, like someone had walked around the porch many times. I didn't step outside right away. I kept scanning the trees before moving out. I went straight to the shed. The flattened grass area behind it was even worse now. The dirt looked disturbed, like someone had been shifting their weight back and forth while sitting there. There were more small bones stacked on the rock. The pile was twice as big. My chest felt tight and hot at the same time. I knew now that someone had been on my property every night, watching, staying close, coming back repeatedly. I spent the whole morning thinking about leaving. The problem was the cabin was deep in the mountains. My car was the only way out, and the road was rough. If something was wrong with the car, I would be stuck. So I checked it. When I reached it, I felt a sharp, cold feeling in my stomach. The driver's side door had muddy fingerprints on the window. Long smudges like someone had pressed their hand there while leaning close to look inside. I crouched down to check the tires, and I found something worse. The back right tire had a deep cut in the rubber. Not all the way through, but deep enough that it could blow out on the mountain road. It was the kind of cut a knife would make. That was the moment everything became real in a way I could not ignore. Someone was out here, close to my cabin, watching me, moving around my property at night and cutting my escape. I spent the rest of the day inside, barricading the door with the small table and chair. I checked all the windows and made sure they were locked tight. I turned off all the lights as soon as the sun went down, even though it made the cabin feel smaller. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed frame and held a heavy iron pan in my hands, the closest thing I had to a weapon. The hours passed slowly. The darkness outside the windows looked thick and heavy. The forest did not feel alive. It felt crowded somehow, like the trees were hiding something. Then the noises started again. One step on the dry leaves. Long pause. Another step, closer to the cabin. Then nothing for several minutes. Then another step on the opposite side of the cabin. Then a scrape, like a boot sliding on dirt. My throat felt dry. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the pan. I listened so hard that my ears hurt. The sounds moved slowly around the cabin, stopping for long stretches. Sometimes I could hear breathing, not loud, but slow and steady, like someone taking calm breaths just outside the wall. Hours passed like that. My body felt numb. My back hurt from sitting still, but I didn't dare move. Near dawn, the noises stopped. The silence felt sudden and heavy. I waited for the sun to rise before I moved at all. When light filled the cabin, I stood up with stiff legs and looked outside carefully. I opened the door slowly and stepped out. The footprints around the cabin had multiplied during the night. They circled the building in overlapping patterns. Some prints came right up to the windows. I walked around the cabin and felt cold all over when I reached the shed. The flattened area behind it was worse than ever. It wasn't even flattened grass anymore. It was a hollow, a clear depression in the ground like someone had been lying there for hours every night. The bone pile was 3 times larger than the day before. I made up my mind to leave that day, even if the tire was damaged. I packed fast, grabbed everything important, and put it in the car. I started the engine. It made a loud, unhealthy sound at first, but then it settled. I began driving slowly down the mountain road, hoping the tire would hold. I kept checking my mirrors. The forest looked empty, but I could not shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. For miles down the road, the back tire finally gave out. The car leaned to the right and I stopped fast. The mountain road was narrow with thick forest on both sides. The air felt dead still. I stepped out and checked the tire. The cut had opened wide, just like I feared. I felt panic climbing up my chest. I looked down the road and then back toward the direction of the cabin. Nothing moved. No sound at all. I grabbed my backpack and started walking fast, almost jogging, because there was no other choice. I knew there was a ranger station several miles away, but I also knew the woods were thick and visibility was poor. After less than half a mile, I heard movement behind me on the road. Slow, heavy steps. Not running, just walking, steady and confident. I didn't look back. I felt like if I turned around, I would see something that would break me. So I kept walking faster until my legs hurt. The steps behind me didn't fade, didn't quicken, just stayed at the same steady pace. I reached a wider area in the road where the trees were thinner, and that was when the steps finally stopped. The silence felt like a weight pressing on my spine. I still didn't look back. I kept walking until the road curved, and then I started running. I didn't stop. I didn't let myself stop until my lungs were burning so badly that I fell to my knees. When I finally reached the ranger station hours later, my clothes were soaked with sweat and cold air. My legs felt weak. I explained everything in broken pieces, shaking so hard I could barely stand. They checked the cabin later that day. They found disturbed ground all around it, footprints, and the bone piles behind the shed. They found signs of long-term human presence around the property. They found areas in the woods where someone had made small hidden camps. Old blankets, cans, plastic wrappers. They found claw marks on several trees, not from animals but from a knife being dragged down the bark. They found nothing else. No person, no body, no tracks leading away. Just signs that someone had been living near my cabin for a very long time. The ending was simple and clear. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the land as fast as I could. I still think about the hollow in the ground behind the shed, the bone piles, the slow steps circling the cabin at night, the cut in my tire, the steady footsteps behind me on the road. Whoever that person was, they knew the woods better than I ever could. They had been living out there long before I arrived, watching quietly, moving carefully. They knew how to avoid being seen. They knew how to get close without being heard. They knew how to wait. They let me leave. But if the tire had blown out a little earlier, or if I had looked back on that road, or if I had stayed one more night in the cabin, I don't think I would be alive to tell this story. That is the simple, realistic truth. And that is the end. I had been planning the trip for weeks, checking weather reports, making lists of supplies, and researching cabins that were remote but still accessible. My life had been unbearably hectic, filled with long work hours, constant notifications, and the endless push of obligations that seemed to stretch every day into a cycle of exhaustion. The idea of disconnecting for a few days, of sitting in a small cabin with nothing but trees and the wind, sounded like salvation. I found a listing for a cabin several hours away, deep in the forest and far from any major roads. The photos were simple but inviting. A small wooden structure, smoke curling from a stone chimney, a porch that looked over a clearing with tall pines and scattered boulders. The description promised solitude and a chance to escape, and that was exactly what I needed. I left early on a Saturday morning, packing the car carefully. I brought extra food, water, batteries, and even a small first aid kit, although I hoped I would never need it. The drive was long and increasingly narrow, the asphalt thinning and eventually giving way to gravel and dirt tracks. The forest grew thicker on both sides, the sunlight filtering in scattered, green-gold patches. By the time I reached the last turnoff, I was already feeling isolated, but in the right way, the way that comes when the world's demands fall away behind you. The road ended at a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It sat solid and unassuming among the trees, with moss creeping along the roof and weathered logs forming the walls. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and a quiet settled around the clearing. It felt almost untouched, like stepping into another pace of life entirely. I parked the car and began unloading my gear, taking care to lock the doors behind me. The cabin had a sturdy wooden door, a small porch with a railing I could lean against while looking out over the forest, and several windows that reflected the bright morning sunlight. Inside, the cabin was modest but functional. A small kitchen area with a propane stove, a sink and cupboards, a single bedroom with a twin bed, and a tiny living area with a worn sofa and a wood-burning fireplace. There was no electricity, other than a solar panel system that powered a few lights and outlets, and no phone signal. I liked that. It made the isolation feel real, grounding. The first day was peaceful. I set up my sleeping area, unpacked supplies, and spent hours wandering the immediate surroundings. The forest was alive with birds, the occasional rustle of small mammals, and the quiet hum of insects. The sun sank slowly, casting long shadows that painted the trees in dramatic lines. I built a fire in the cabin's fireplace, watching it crackle and sending waves of warmth through the room. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice, drank water from my filtered supply, and then spent the evening reading by the fire, listening to the wind in the trees. By the time I went to bed, I felt the heavy weight of modern life lifting off my shoulders. Sleep came easily. The second day began similarly. I woke early, ate a simple breakfast, and set out to explore further. The forest extended in every direction, dense and unbroken except for a few animal trails and shallow streams. I had a small map and a compass, and I kept track of my route carefully. I found a clearing near a small pond, the water mirror still, reflecting the sky and surrounding trees. I stayed there for a while, watching birds skitter across the surface and noting the tracks of deer along the muddy bank. It was perfect. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to lower, lighting the forest in warm golds and deep greens. That night, I felt the first faint unease. Not exactly fear, but a heightened awareness. The forest sounded different in the darkness. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch seemed more pronounced. It was natural, I reminded myself. The woods were alive, and I was simply learning to listen. I settled this feeling with another fire, strong and bright, and by the time I lay down to sleep, I had convinced myself it was nothing but the normal sounds of a dense forest at night. The next day, I ventured further. I wanted to hike a marked trail that the cabin's listing had mentioned, a loop that would take me deep into the forest and eventually return. I left early, carrying a day pack with water, snacks, and a small first aid kit. The trail was overgrown in places, and the forest grew thicker and darker. I had to push branches aside and step over roots. Around midday, I reached a point where the trail split, and I paused to check my map. One path seemed less worn but shorter. The other was wider, more obvious, and continued further into the forest. I chose the wider path, feeling confident in my navigation. The forest closed in around me. Light grew dim under the canopy. Shadows deepened, and every step seemed louder than the last. I passed a small stream, stepping carefully over wet rocks, and then came to an area where the trail became indistinct. Mud covered the ground, and fallen trees blocked the path. I found myself improvising, stepping off the trail, thinking I could skirt around obstacles and rejoin it later. This is when the sense of isolation intensified. I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. Looking around, every tree looked similar, every slope and hollow blending together. I checked my compass, then my map, trying to orient myself, but the more I tried to pinpoint my location, the less certain I became. A cold knot of panic started to form in my stomach. I had brought enough water and food for the day, but I had not prepared for being lost overnight. I kept moving, telling myself I could retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My pace increased, and the underbrush tore at my pants and scratched my arms. The sunlight had shifted, and I realized the afternoon was advancing quickly. Shadows lengthened, and the familiar forest sounds began to change. The birds quieted, leaving only the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a distant branch, and my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. After what felt like hours, I found a slightly higher area and climbed onto a moss-covered rock to get a better view. The forest stretched as far as I could see, unbroken and vast. No cabin, no road, no sign of a trail. I felt the first real fear of the trip, that raw, gut-deep panic that comes when you understand that help is not immediately available. I tried to calm myself, to think logically. I sat down, breathing heavily, and considered my options. I could try to backtrack, though I was unsure of the original route. I could stay put and wait for help, but that was unlikely. I was too far from any road or cell signal for anyone to come looking that quickly. I resolved to move carefully, making mental notes of landmarks, hoping to eventually find the trail again. Hours passed. I stumbled through underbrush, climbed over fallen logs, and crawled over muddy banks. My legs were scratched and bruised, and my shoes were soaked from waterlogged ground. I grew tired, hungry, and thirsty. My water supply had dwindled to a third of what I brought. I had eaten a few snacks, but it wasn't enough to sustain me. The sun sank lower, casting deep orange light through the treetops, making the forest glow in an almost surreal way. The warmth of the day faded rapidly. I realized I would not make it back to the cabin before nightfall. My fear turned to urgency. I needed shelter. I found a small natural depression under a leaning tree, and though it was wet and uncomfortable, I decided to make it my temporary camp for the night. I arranged branches for a makeshift barrier against the wind, tried to gather some dry leaves for insulation, and huddled against the tree. Darkness fell fast, absolute and dense. Without the sun, the forest felt enormous and alive with unknown sounds. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth was magnified. My own breath sounded too loud. I felt exposed, small, and vulnerable in a way I had never experienced before. Sleep came fitfully. I would doze for a few minutes, wake up at every sound, tense and ready to run. The cold seeped through my clothes, and I shifted constantly to retain warmth. The night seemed endless, stretching every minute into an hour. At one point, I heard the unmistakable growl of an animal in the distance. My mind jumped to worst-case scenarios, a bear, a mountain lion, but I reminded myself that panicking would not help. I stayed still, listening, counting the seconds between sounds, judging distance. Eventually, the noises receded, leaving only the wind. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I felt both relief and exhaustion. I had survived the night, but the forest was still a vast and intimidating place. The morning light brought renewed determination. I knew I could not stay in that improvised shelter any longer. My first priority was water and orientation. I remembered the stream I had passed the day before, hoping it could lead me back to the trail or even toward the cabin. I carefully made my way down, slipping on mud and balancing along narrow banks, until I reached the stream. The water was cold and clear. I drank sparingly, just enough to sustain myself, and followed the stream downstream, reasoning that streams often lead to roads or human habitation. Hours passed, my progress slow but steady. My legs were sore, my body tired, but my mind focused. Every landmark became critical. A twisted tree, a boulder, a clearing with sunlit moss. The forest still felt intimidating, but I was learning its rhythms, its signs, and how to move without exhausting myself completely. By mid-afternoon, I began to recognize subtle changes in the terrain. The trees grew slightly more spaced, the ground less tangled with underbrush. I caught a glimpse of a familiar rock formation, and my heart lifted with hope. Soon, I saw the faint outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief crashed over me in waves, a mix of exhaustion, joy, and disbelief. I hurried the remaining distance, every step bringing me closer to safety. When I finally reached the cabin, I collapsed on the porch, breathing heavily, the sun warm on my face. The structure, the familiar smell of wood and pine, the sight of the chimney, grounded me. I had been away from civilization, pushed to the edge of my own endurance, and yet I had found my way back. The next days passed with cautious routine. I stayed close to the cabin, reinforcing my awareness of my surroundings and carefully mapping the trails within walking distance. I rebuilt my fire each night, cooked meals, and rested. The experience left me shaken, but also profoundly grateful for my preparation and my ability to navigate under stress. I realized that fear in the wild was a tool, something to heighten awareness, but also something that could be controlled with logic and careful observation. By the time I left the cabin, I was tired but more confident, stronger in ways I hadn't anticipated. I packed carefully, locked the cabin, and took one last look at the clearing. The forest stretched endlessly, unchanged and indifferent, but I had conquered my own fear within it. The drive home was quiet, reflective. I carried the memory of the forest's vastness, the night's cold and isolation, and the relief of survival with me. It was a story I would carry for life, not as a tale of terror, but as a lesson in resilience, patience, and the stark reality of nature. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. Work had been relentless, draining all the energy I had, and the constant hum of the city had started to feel like a cage. When I found the listing for the cabin online, it looked perfect, remote, secluded, right on the edge of the forest. I wanted nothing more than silence, nothing more than to be cut off from the constant buzz of people and cars, emails and phones. I rented the cabin for 3 nights and I packed lightly, just essentials, enough food for the days, some water, and my camera. I liked to photograph nature, though it was more about being alone than any real artistic drive. The drive out there was long, winding, and for the last few miles, the asphalt gave way to a narrow dirt road. The kind of road that made you wish you had a truck instead of a small sedan. The kind where every bump reminded you how far you were from anything resembling help. I remember the sun dipping low as I finally crested a small hill and saw the cabin tucked between 2 groves of tall pine trees, a small clearing around it, and a creek nearby that reflected the last golden light of the evening. It looked like one of those postcards of solitude, perfect and untouched. The first thing I noticed when I got out of the car was how quiet it was. I didn't just mean the absence of cars or people. There was a weight to the quiet, a density in the air that made every sound I made feel sharp, almost intrusive. The leaves rustled slightly in the breeze, the creek gurgled softly, but that was it. Nothing else. I unloaded my bag, slipped the key into the door, and stepped inside. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood and something earthy, like it had absorbed the forest itself. It was simple. A small living space, a kitchenette, a bedroom with a large window that faced the creek, and a bathroom. There was no electricity beyond a few overhead lights that worked with a generator or maybe a solar panel, but I didn't care. The idea was to disconnect, to live without constant notifications or the glow of a phone. I set my things down, unlocked the windows, and just stood for a moment, letting the air settle around me. The first night was quiet in a comfortable way. I made a small fire in the stone fireplace, ate a simple dinner, and went to bed early. The bed was stiff but not uncomfortable. I remember lying there, listening to the creek outside, feeling like I had finally escaped the city. That's when I first noticed it. A sound faint at first, barely more than a whisper against the forest, like footsteps on the dry leaves outside. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a fox. I had seen tracks on the way in, so it made sense. But the sound persisted, irregular, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. I didn't sleep well that night. Every crack of the wood settling, every whisper of wind against the cabin, made me flinch. I kept imagining someone, or something, was walking just outside, circling the cabin, watching. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, camera in hand, noting the tracks in the mud. There were deer tracks, definitely, maybe a raccoon or 2, but nothing that looked like a human. The forest was dense, and it was easy to imagine shapes in the shadows. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the isolation was getting to me. Still, the tension didn't leave. By the second night, it had grown heavier. The sounds outside seemed sharper, more deliberate. Footsteps that weren't quite animal, the snap of a branch under weight that seemed too heavy to be a fox. I found myself checking the locks on the door repeatedly. Every creak of the house settling felt like someone moving inside it. I tried to focus on small tasks: stacking firewood, cleaning the small kitchen, organizing my camera equipment. But the feeling never went away. It was as if the forest itself was watching. Then, on the third day, something happened that turned all of my fears into stark reality. I had been taking photos of the creek, following the water downstream, when I noticed something odd. There were footprints along the muddy edge, not animal, human. I froze, trying to tell myself it was impossible. Who would be out here? The nearest neighbors were miles away, the cabin hidden deep in the woods. The footprints weren't fresh, but they were clear, and they led toward my cabin. My heart started racing. I looked around, calling myself an idiot for being afraid of nothing. I went back quickly, and that's when I saw it. On the cabin window facing the creek, there were marks, smudges in the condensation, long streaks that didn't belong. Not scratches, but traces that looked like fingers. I couldn't be sure, my mind racing, but it made a chilling sense. Someone had been here, close enough to touch the windows, close enough to watch. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting in the living room, a heavy, wrenching fear in my stomach. Every sound outside made me flinch. At one point, I thought I saw movement, a shadow moving between the trees, slow, careful. I didn't dare look closely, didn't dare even consider what it could be. I felt trapped in the cabin, and yet stepping outside felt impossible. The following morning, I decided I had to leave, immediately. I packed quickly, checking every window and door before I left. That's when I noticed something else. My car had been tampered with. The gas cap was open, and there were fresh scratch marks on the side, as though someone had run a key along the paint. My heart sank. Whoever had been circling the cabin wasn't just curious. They had been here, preparing, waiting. I didn't stop to think. I didn't argue with myself. I ran to the road, my bag slung over my shoulder, and started the car. The engine turned over, thankfully, and I drove as fast as I dared on the narrow dirt road. The woods seemed to press in on either side, but I didn't look back. Every shadow that flicked across the trees made me flinch. Every sound of a branch snapping made me glance into the rearview mirror. I finally reached the main road, the asphalt smooth and comforting under the tires. I drove straight to the nearest town, parked, and went into a diner to collect myself. I called the local police, explained the situation. They listened, took my statement, and then told me the area had a few incidents recently. Isolated, mostly theft or intimidation, people targeting cabins deep in the forest. They said I was lucky to get out when I did. I didn't go back. The cabin was rented out again eventually, but I couldn't bring myself to return. The memory of that isolation, the feeling of being watched, has stayed with me. Sometimes I see shadows in the city at night, or hear footsteps behind me on a quiet street, and the memory flashes back, unbidden. I learned that solitude, when combined with human malice, is more terrifying than anything the mind can conjure on its own. I think about that weekend often, about the feeling of complete vulnerability in a place meant to be safe. I think about the marks on the window, the footprints by the creek, the scratches on my car. And I'm grateful that I made it out, that I didn't wait one moment too long, because I now know the line between safety and danger can be thinner than a shadow in the forest. The cabin taught me to respect isolation and to be cautious, always, even when it seems peaceful. I never returned to the woods, and I never will. But I carry that lesson with me. I carry it in the careful checking of doors, in the way I look around when I walk alone, in the way I plan trips and think about distance and access. Fear, real fear, is grounded not in ghosts or legends, but in the knowledge that humans can be unpredictable and dangerous, even in the most beautiful and serene places. That weekend changed the way I see the world, the way I move through it, and the way I think about safety. Looking back, I realized the forest itself had nothing to do with the fear. It was the human presence, the intrusion, that made everything terrifying. And somehow, surviving it has made me more careful, more aware, and strangely grateful for the lesson. I no longer crave isolation in the deep woods. I no longer romanticize it. Safety, I learned, is more important than solitude, and I am lucky, more than lucky, to have learned that without paying the highest price. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully choosing a small cabin deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization. I wanted silence, a break from the constant noise and obligations of city life, and I thought this cabin would offer exactly that. The drive was long, more exhausting than I expected, twisting through narrow roads surrounded by dense forests, the kind of forest that pressed in from both sides, making the road feel like a tunnel of trees. When I finally arrived, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the uneven ground. The cabin was small, built of rough timber, and smelled faintly of old wood and damp moss. The windows were dusty, and the steps to the front door creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was more than just basic. It had a small kitchen with a gas stove, a table and chairs, a bathroom with a shower that smelled faintly of rust, and a tiny living area with a sofa that sagged in the middle. The floorboards groaned slightly under every step, a reminder that the house was old, but solid. I unpacked my things slowly, placing them carefully on the table and the sofa, making the place feel like mine for the next few days. Outside, the forest was quiet, too quiet. There were birds, a few scattered squirrels, and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind blew. That was all. At first, I thought it was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made a person feel detached from the rest of the world, free to think without interruption. The first night, I made a small fire in the old metal stove in the corner of the room. The fire crackled and popped, filling the cabin with warmth. I prepared some simple food, a can of beans and some bread, and ate slowly while sitting near the stove. Outside, the darkness of the forest was complete. I could hear the wind in the trees, a faint rustling that sometimes sounded like footsteps, but I kept telling myself it was just the wind. By the time I went to bed, the cabin was silent except for the occasional settling creak of the building. I slept, though not deeply, and I woke several times to the sounds of branches scraping against the roof and the distant howl of a coyote. It was normal, I reminded myself. Forest sounds were normal, nothing more. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I walked along narrow paths, overgrown with underbrush, the kind of path that was barely visible except for a few broken twigs and flattened grass. I noticed small signs that wildlife was everywhere. Deer tracks in the soft soil, the remains of a raccoon's meal near a stream, and broken branches where some animal must have pushed through. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I found a small clearing with a view of the distant mountains, the sunlight filtering through the trees. It was breathtaking, but also unnerving in its emptiness. There was no sign of other people, no cabins, no distant roads, nothing but trees. I told myself this was what I wanted, the isolation, but a part of me felt tense, aware that if something went wrong, there would be no one to help me. That night, the sounds of the forest seemed louder. I was cooking a simple meal again, and I thought I heard something at the edge of the clearing just beyond the window. A movement quick and sharp. I froze, listening. The branches rustled again, and I could hear the crunch of something moving through leaves. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a coyote, and I tried to focus on cooking. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the cabin, and I felt the first real sense of unease. I kept the stove going, kept the fire alive, but every shadow in the room seemed to stretch and twist, reaching toward me in the flickering light. I went to bed early, pulling the blanket tightly around myself, listening to the forest as if it could speak, as if it could tell me something I didn't want to hear. The following morning, I found the first tangible sign that something wasn't right. Near the cabin, on the path I had walked the day before, there were footprints. They were large, human-like, and they led directly to the cabin door before disappearing into the trees again. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach knotting. I had seen animals, but these were human prints. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, all secure, but the feeling of being watched began to settle over me, heavy and uncomfortable. I told myself it was probably a hiker or someone passing through, but there had been no cars on the road, no other houses. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing, and I forced myself to continue with my day, though I walked around the cabin with a heightened awareness, checking behind trees and bushes, listening for any sound of movement. Over the next 2 days, things escalated slowly. I would wake to find items slightly moved. Small things like a jar of beans on the counter shifted, or my shoes at the edge of the table rather than neatly under it. I convinced myself I must be misremembering, or that the movement was caused by a draft or by the uneven floor. But then I started noticing sounds outside at night. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. The occasional knock or tap against the wood, light enough to be overlooked but enough to make my heart race. I stopped leaving the door unlocked even when I went to the bathroom. I checked the windows constantly. I started leaving the stove and fire burning in the evenings, though I rarely cooked anything, just to make the cabin feel alive, less empty. My nerves were taut, and sleep became shallow, haunted by the sensation of being watched, though I could never see anyone when I opened my eyes. By the 4th day, I realized I was in danger. It became obvious that someone had been around the cabin during the night. There were more footprints, not just human, but sometimes dragging marks, as if someone had been moving something heavy. I found small piles of broken twigs and disturbed leaves around the perimeter, as if someone had walked the same circle multiple times. I checked the locks repeatedly, double-checked windows, even barricaded the front door with a chair. I started keeping a heavy stick by the bed, ready to use if necessary. I stopped exploring the woods, instead staying inside and watching the edge of the clearing through the dusty windows. Every rustle, every shadow, felt like a threat. I could not see anyone, but I knew I was not alone. The isolation I had sought had become a trap. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a cage with invisible walls. The 5th day, I found evidence that terrified me completely. On the back porch, someone had left a small pile of personal items. A worn glove, a tattered notebook, and a small rock with my name written on it in dirt. My stomach turned. This was deliberate. Someone had been here, watching me, tracking me, and now they were signaling that they knew I was aware. I spent hours inspecting the cabin, searching for any hidden entrance, any sign of intrusion. I found none. No broken boards, no cut locks, nothing. It was infuriating and terrifying at the same time. Whoever it was, they knew how to stay hidden. I felt cornered, and the sense of urgency grew. I needed to leave, but the road was far, and I had no cell signal. I could not call for help. I could only wait, plan, and hope that I could get out without encountering the person. That night, the tension reached its peak. The footsteps were louder, closer, circling the cabin repeatedly. At one point, I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, outside the door. I stayed in the corner, the stick ready, my heart pounding. The air felt thick, oppressive, and I could hear my own rapid breaths as if they were a warning. The movements outside stopped suddenly, leaving a silence that was even worse than the noise. Every second dragged, each one stretching into an eternity of fear. I could not sleep. I stayed alert, eyes fixed on the door, ears straining for the smallest sound. I realized that the only way out was to confront the forest, to leave the cabin and run, even though I did not know what I would find on the path ahead. At first light, I made my move. I packed my things as quickly and quietly as possible, leaving nothing behind that could slow me down. I checked the locks, left the cabin as it was, and stepped into the morning light. The forest was still quiet, but I knew that it would not remain so for long. I moved fast, taking the path I had walked before, eyes scanning constantly for movement, ears straining for sound. The wind was my ally, rustling through the trees and masking the noises of my own steps. I followed the trail to the road, which seemed impossibly far. Each step felt heavy, each shadow threatening. But finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the edge of the clearing where the road emerged. My heart leapt with relief. I ran the last stretch, reaching the road just as a vehicle appeared in the distance. I waved frantically, and the car slowed. The driver, a middle-aged man, seemed startled but stopped and asked if I was okay. I could not speak properly, only shake my head and point back toward the cabin. He helped me into the car, and we drove to the nearest town, where I contacted the authorities. The police went to the cabin later that day, but there was no one there. The cabin was empty, except for the signs of intrusion that I had seen. Footprints led into the forest but went no further. Whatever had been watching me had vanished. The experience left me shaken for months. I could not return to that forest, and I could not shake the feeling of being watched, even in the city. But I survived. I learned that isolation, no matter how peaceful it seems, can become dangerous when someone else decides to invade it. And I learned that survival sometimes depends not on courage, but on observation, patience, and the willingness to act quickly when danger is near. I never returned to that cabin, but I remember every detail. The creak of the floorboards, the shifting shadows, the feeling of eyes on me even when I was alone. And I know that the forest can hold secrets that are very real, very human, and very dangerous. Even now, when I am alone in my apartment, I cannot ignore every rustle, every creak, every shadow, without remembering that cabin, and the unseen person who could have ended everything in a heartbeat. But I survived, and that clarity, that relief is something I carry with me. I will never forget how close I came to being trapped, how fragile my sense of safety was, and how one wrong step in the wrong place can turn silence into terror. I had been driving for hours, my body stiff and my mind half numb from the monotonous road stretching through the dense forest. The sky had begun to darken with heavy clouds, and the rain that had been drizzling intermittently became steady, forming rivulets that ran across the windshield. I was heading to a cabin I had rented on the outskirts of a remote forest area, the kind of place advertised as secluded, peaceful, and perfect for a weekend getaway. I had been craving solitude for months, a break from the noise and the constant demands of my life in the city. I didn't want neighbors, tourists, or anyone else. Just the forest, a small cabin, and the silence that I could barely remember having experienced in my adult life. The road narrowed as I left the main highway, turning into a rough gravel path barely wide enough for one car. Trees loomed close on both sides, their branches hanging over the road like skeletal fingers. The rain-slicked path reflected the dim light from my headlights, creating the illusion that the road was moving beneath me. I had no cell phone signal as soon as I turned onto this path, something I had anticipated but didn't fully appreciate until I realized that if anything went wrong, I was completely alone. My mind flickered briefly with unease, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the road. Finally, after what felt like endless miles of narrow, twisting path, I saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. It was a modest structure made of aged wood, with a small porch that sagged slightly and windows that reflected the gray sky. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, suggesting that the fireplace inside had been lit, perhaps by the caretaker or previous visitors. Despite the rain, I felt a small thrill of relief. The cabin was exactly what I had hoped for, isolated and quiet. I parked my car in the uneven dirt driveway and grabbed my bag from the back seat. The rain soaked me within seconds, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. I hurried to the cabin, fumbling with the key I had received beforehand. The door opened with a creak, and I stepped inside, immediately greeted by a surprisingly warm and dry interior. The faint smell of wood smoke lingered, and the cabin had a rustic charm with wooden floors, a small kitchenette, a simple table, and a few chairs. A narrow staircase led to a loft bedroom. I set down my bag and lit the fireplace. The crackling of the fire filled the space with warmth and a sense of security. Outside, the rain continued to pour, the wind rattling the roof. I made myself a cup of tea and sat near the window, listening to the rain. The forest beyond the cabin looked dark and impenetrable, the trees swaying with the gusts of wind. At first, it felt peaceful. I had imagined this moment countless times. Sitting alone in a cabin, rain tapping against the windows, nothing but nature around me. But there was also something unnerving about the isolation. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being alone in such a remote place. As evening fell, I prepared a simple meal and ate while sitting at the table. The sound of the fire and the rain were my only companions. I double-checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the trees. I felt a strange, creeping anxiety, the kind that starts in your stomach and slowly climbs up your chest. Around midnight, I went upstairs to the loft bedroom. The room was small but comfortable, with a single bed, a thin rug on the floor, and a small dresser. I lay down, hoping to fall asleep to the sound of rain. But I couldn't. Every gust of wind made the cabin groan, and every tree branch scraping against the roof or siding made me tense. My mind began to wander, imagining every possible danger in the forest outside. Wild animals, falling trees, someone sneaking up on the cabin. I told myself these were irrational thoughts, that I was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. A soft thud outside, coming from the edge of the clearing. My heart began to race. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Another thud, then another, irregular and heavy, like someone walking through the wet underbrush. I froze, straining to hear, the sound mingling with the storm. I grabbed a flashlight from the dresser and slowly opened the loft window. The rain had eased slightly, but the forest outside was dark and wet. I scanned the clearing with the beam of the flashlight. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the muddy ground. I lowered the light, trying to calm myself. Maybe it had been a branch falling or an animal. But then I heard a more distinct sound. Something dragging. It was low and wet, scraping against the dirt. My stomach dropped. The sound was coming closer. I backed away from the window and turned toward the staircase. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but the rain outside made that impossible. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, holding it tightly in my hand. I crept to the loft door and listened. The dragging sound had stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I waited, my ears straining. Then I heard it again, this time from the side of the cabin. I realized I had left the back door unlocked. My stomach churned as I pictured someone slipping inside, watching me sleep. I forced myself to stay calm. I descended the stairs quietly, the knife in my hand. The cabin felt enormous in the dark, the shadows cast by the fire flickering on the walls. I moved slowly to the back door, heart pounding, and locked it. The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed too loudly in the empty cabin. For the next hour, I sat by the fireplace, listening. The storm outside had calmed slightly, but I could still hear the occasional rustle from the forest. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the unease. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came slowly, gray and damp. The storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping and the air heavy with moisture. I forced myself to eat breakfast and pack my things. I couldn't stay another night. I had imagined enjoying a weekend alone, but the fear of the unknown in the forest, the sense of being watched, had made the cabin unbearable. As I drove back along the gravel path, I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see someone following me. The road seemed longer in the daylight, but the fear persisted. I finally reached the main highway, where the noise and the presence of other people brought some comfort. I told myself I would never return to that cabin, no matter how quiet or isolated it seemed. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I replayed it in my mind, analyzing every sound, every movement. I realized that what had frightened me wasn't a ghost or a fairy tale creature. It was the simple, real possibility of danger. The forest could hide anyone. The storm could make the cabin vulnerable. The isolation made me feel small, exposed, and powerless. And that, I realized, was scarier than anything imaginary. Eventually, I found a way to use the experience to my advantage. I learned to appreciate solitude in smaller doses, in places where I had some control. I researched cabins more thoroughly, choosing locations that were remote but accessible, with neighbors within a reasonable distance and cell phone reception. I still visited forests and secluded areas, but I never underestimated the reality of isolation again. In the end, the cabin became a lesson rather than just a terrifying memory. It taught me to respect nature, to anticipate risk, and to acknowledge fear without letting it dominate me. The memory of that night still comes back sometimes, especially when I am alone in quiet, dark spaces. But now, instead of pure fear, I feel a sense of awareness and preparedness. I know that real danger doesn't need ghosts or legends. It can exist in simple things like a dark forest, a stormy night, and a moment of human vulnerability. And that knowledge, as unsettling as it is, has made me stronger. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of getting away from everything, from the noise, the constant buzz of work, traffic, and endless obligations, had become a kind of obsession. I needed silence, solitude, and the chance to reset, to breathe without being pulled in a dozen directions at once. So I rented a small cabin in the mountains, tucked away in a dense forest far from the nearest town. I had gone through photos online, maps, reviews. The cabin was isolated, but not completely off the grid. It had electricity, running water, and a small generator as a backup. The description promised seclusion and peace. I needed peace more than anything. I arrived in late afternoon. The sun hung low behind thick clouds, casting an orange glow through the trees. The winding dirt road to the cabin had been rough, and my car shook and rattled over rocks and roots, but I made it without incident. When I finally pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, I felt a mixture of relief and excitement. It was everything I wanted. Small, wooden, a little weathered but sturdy, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. A narrow stream ran nearby, its water clear and cold, and I could hear the sound of it gurgling over rocks even from where I parked. I took my bags and unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and a faint trace of mildew, but it was clean. The living space was small but functional, with a wood stove, a kitchenette, and a small table. A staircase led up to a loft with a bed, and a tiny bathroom was tucked in a corner. I set my things down, feeling an immediate sense of relief and satisfaction. This was going to be perfect. At least that's what I thought. After a quick unpacking, I went outside to take in the surroundings. The forest was dense, the trees tall and close together. Birds called from the treetops, and the wind whispered through the branches. It was beautiful, calming, exactly the kind of escape I had imagined. I walked down to the stream, crouched on a smooth rock, and let my hands trail in the cold water. The sound of the forest, the smell of wet earth, it all made me feel lighter, like the weight of the city was draining away. I lingered there, enjoying the quiet, until the sky began to darken. The sun was gone, leaving only the gray-blue light of dusk. When I returned to the cabin, I started a fire in the stove, fed it with dry logs I had found stacked near the cabin. I prepared a simple meal from supplies I had brought: pasta, canned vegetables, some fresh bread. Eating alone, by the warm fire, surrounded by the stillness of the forest, was exactly what I wanted. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and calm. As darkness fully settled, the forest transformed. What had been comforting and serene during the day became unfamiliar and unpredictable at night. The sounds were different: twigs snapping under invisible weight, animals rustling through leaves, the occasional distant cry that I couldn't identify. I reminded myself that the forest was alive, that it was normal for animals to move around at night. I had grown up camping, hiking, and I understood the sounds. But still, there was a sharp edge to the darkness, a weight pressing in that I hadn't felt during the day. I went to bed early, wanting to wake refreshed for a hike the next day. The loft was small and the mattress firm, but I was exhausted. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, leaving a faint warmth that seeped into the room. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night. My heart was racing before I even knew why. The cabin was pitch dark except for the faint glow of embers in the stove. I froze, straining to hear any unusual sound. At first, I thought it was just the forest, the wind rattling the cabin, branches brushing against the roof. But then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside the cabin. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or other animal, but heavy, intentional footsteps. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor, but the closest cabin was more than a mile away, and I hadn't seen anyone on the road. Maybe a hiker who had lost their way, but even that didn't explain the deliberate circling, the way the footsteps stopped and started at different points. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps continued, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves under heavy boots. My chest tightened with fear, but I tried to stay rational. I didn't have a phone with service, so calling for help wasn't an option. I thought about getting my hunting knife from my bag, but I didn't want to make any noise. Whoever was outside could be dangerous. I couldn't tell if they were just curious, lost, or worse. I held my breath, barely daring to move, as the footsteps continued their slow path around the cabin. Then suddenly they stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind and the distant sound of the stream. My pulse felt deafening in my ears. I debated my options. I could stay in the loft, hide under the blankets, hope whoever it was would leave. Or I could try to escape. Leaving the cabin meant stepping outside into the dark forest, where I couldn't see or know what I might face. I decided to stay, reasoning that the cabin was safer with walls and a locked door. I sat in the loft, clutching the knife, straining to hear any movement. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching endlessly. Eventually, I drifted back into a tense, uneasy sleep, my mind replaying every possible scenario. I woke to the faint light of morning. The forest looked completely different in daylight, calm and familiar again. My first impulse was to check the perimeter of the cabin. I slipped out quietly, keeping the knife in hand. The ground around the cabin was disturbed. Footprints, heavy boots, circling from the front door to the back. They were large, unmistakably human. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been outside all night. I looked around the clearing, but there was no one in sight. No car tracks, no evidence of how they had arrived. Only the footprints remained, leading into the dense forest. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to confront whoever it was. The rest of the day was tense. I stayed mostly inside, venturing out only briefly to collect firewood or fill my water bottle. Every sound made me jump. I kept imagining someone hiding in the trees, watching, waiting. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was far, and my car might not handle the rough roads again so soon. I needed to think of a safer way to handle this. By nightfall, I had devised a plan. I moved furniture in front of the door to make entry more difficult. I kept the knife close and improvised an alarm system. Some old cans tied together with string along the perimeter, which would clatter if someone stepped on them. I went to bed with a sense of grim determination, knowing I had to stay alert. That night, the footsteps returned. I could hear them circling again, slower this time, as if whoever it was testing the cabin. Then I heard a sound I hadn't expected, a soft tap at the window. My heart slammed. The window was locked, but whoever was outside could be close. I waited, paralyzed, listening to their movements. They paced, stopped, then the tapping returned, again and again like deliberate signals. My mind raced with scenarios, and fear threatened to overwhelm me. I gripped the knife and whispered to myself that I had to stay calm, that panic would be worse. Eventually, the tapping stopped, the footsteps faded, and silence returned. I didn't sleep much after that, just lay awake, listening, waiting for any sign of movement. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When the sun finally rose, I made a careful inspection outside. The footprints had returned, circling again, fresh and deep. Someone had been there all night. But this time I noticed something else. They weren't alone. There were smaller prints, almost like children's boots or someone trailing behind. I froze. This wasn't random trespassing. Someone had been intentionally near the cabin, observing, maybe planning. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and left. I didn't look back. My mind focused entirely on getting down the mountain and to safety. I drove slowly, keeping an eye on the forest edges. The dirt road seemed longer and rougher than before. Every shadow in the trees made me tense. I reached the nearest town just as the sun was high, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I stopped at a small cafe to collect myself. I told the staff I had felt unsafe and needed somewhere crowded and public. They looked concerned but polite. I didn't mention the footprints, the tapping, or the circling. I wasn't sure how much of it they would believe. I just needed safety. Over the next few days, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They took notes, listened carefully, and promised to check the area. They suggested that other people had reported similar experiences. Strangers lurking near cabins, observing visitors. It seemed to be some pattern of trespassing, possibly criminal. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tale creatures or anything I had imagined in the dark. It was human and it was dangerous. Eventually, I returned home, shaken but unharmed. The experience stayed with me for weeks, the cold fear of being watched, the sense of vulnerability in isolation. I realized that solitude in the wilderness wasn't always peaceful. The forest could be quiet, beautiful, and calming, but it could also be a place where someone with ill intent could watch and wait, hidden just beyond sight. I appreciated the city more than I had before, for all its noise and obligations, for the safety it offered. The experience changed how I approached my trips afterward. I became more cautious, always checking maps, neighbors, and local reports. I invested in better locks, motion sensor lights, and even carried a small GPS beacon for emergencies. I still loved the mountains, the forest, the idea of isolation, but I knew now that realism mattered more than fantasy. The real threats were human, and awareness, preparation, and caution were the only ways to stay safe. Years later, I returned to the same cabin. This time, I had a friend with me. We drove the same rough road, but I felt no thrill, no carefree joy. I had learned too much about fear, about what it meant to be alone in the wrong place at the wrong time. We walked the perimeter carefully, checked the windows and doors, and made sure the place was secure. The forest was the same, serene and beautiful, but my perspective had changed. I saw it not just as peace and isolation, but as a place where vigilance mattered, where the human element could turn beauty into danger. That knowledge didn't ruin the experience. It made it more real, more grounded, and ultimately more empowering. I could enjoy the forest, the cabin, the solitude, but on my terms, with awareness, with preparation, and with respect for the reality that humans, not ghosts or fantasies, were the real danger. That trip, years later, ended safely, with no incidents, but the memory of that first night, the cold, calculated fear, the circling footprints, the tapping on the window, never left me. I learned that real terror doesn't need monsters. It needs vulnerability, isolation, and the awareness that someone else, real and human, could be watching, waiting, and planning. And surviving that fear, facing it realistically, gave me a clarity I had never had before. It was a lesson in caution, preparation, and understanding the limits of solitude. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in the woods seemed perfect at the time. My work had been suffocating, and the constant noise of the city had worn me down. I wanted silence, the kind of silence that made you notice every leaf that fell, every bird that stirred in the trees, every crack of a branch under your own feet. I rented a small, isolated cabin several miles deep into the national forest. It was off the grid, with no electricity except a small generator and no running water except for a creek that ran nearby. The reviews online had called it rustic, peaceful, and isolated. That last one had drawn me in the most. The first day was uneventful. The drive up the winding forest road had been long, the kind where the trees seemed to lean closer and closer as you ascend into the hills. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as it had in the pictures. A small wooden structure, aged by decades of weather, with a tin roof that reflected the weak afternoon sun. A stone chimney rose from one side, smoke curling lazily into the sky. The porch creaked under my boots as I walked around to take it all in. Everything smelled of pine and wet earth, a smell I had always loved. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to place items where I would need them, unpacking food, clothes, and supplies. By evening, I had built a fire in the stone fireplace, the smell of smoke filling the cabin and mixing with the scent of pine from the open windows. I sat back in the old wooden chair, feeling a peace I hadn't known in months. The first night was quiet but not silent. There were sounds I didn't recognize. Branches snapping, a distant bird calling, the low hum of insects. I slept fitfully, half aware of every noise, but it felt safe. It was natural, like the world outside had its own rhythm, and I was only a small part of it. In the morning, I explored the nearby woods. The creek was cold and fast-moving, glinting in the sunlight. I filled my water bottles, checking for cleanliness as best I could, and marveled at how untouched this place felt. No footprints but my own marked the ground. I hiked a few miles, noting the paths I took in my journal so I would not get lost. The isolation was intoxicating. It was on the third day that I began noticing the first unsettling signs. First, it was small. I had hung a few clothes on the porch railing to dry, and I noticed one shirt was on the ground. I was certain I had left it hanging. I shrugged it off, assuming a gust of wind had knocked it down. Later, while gathering firewood, I found small scraps of bark placed neatly around the edge of the pile. I didn't think much of it at first, considering it a quirk of the way the trees fell or how animals had dragged things around. But then I noticed footprints. Not deer or raccoon prints, but human. Small, thin, shoe-like imprints in the mud near the cabin. I had parked my car just outside the porch, and there was no one else around, at least none I had seen. I checked the door locks, which were still secure, and convinced myself I was imagining things. The forest plays tricks on the eyes. Shadows fall in ways that create shapes you think you recognize. I told myself to ignore it, to focus on the peacefulness I had come for. That night, I slept poorly. Every snap of a twig outside made my heart jump. I woke multiple times, staring into the darkness of the cabin, listening for any hint of movement. At around 2 in the morning, I heard it, a very soft scraping at the window nearest the bed. My eyes snapped open. I stayed still, listening. The scraping stopped. I waited, the silence thick and heavy. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I dozed off, but not deeply. The fourth day, I decided to hike farther into the forest. I packed a small backpack with water, food, a first aid kit, and my phone, though I knew I had little service. The trail led up a ridge, offering views of the valley below, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The further I went, the more I noticed signs that someone else had been there recently. A small campsite, long abandoned, but with remnants of a fire and a few scraps of cloth. I examined it but found nothing that identified who might have been there. It made me uneasy, but I told myself it was normal. The forest is big. People hike here, camp here. The rational part of me clung to that idea, though the irrational part, the one that felt my heartbeat pick up whenever a shadow shifted, refused to calm down completely. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. The door was still locked, but my unease had grown. I checked the perimeter, scanning for any sign of intrusion, but found nothing. I tried to shake off the feeling, lighting a fire and sitting near it as I ate my dinner. I kept the windows closed that night, the door bolted tightly. I slept lightly, aware of every sound. The fifth day was when things escalated. I woke to find the firewood pile disturbed. Pieces of wood were stacked differently. Some moved closer to the cabin, some farther away. It was subtle, almost easily ignored, but I noticed immediately. My stomach sank. I had not touched the wood since I stacked it. My mind raced through possibilities. Animals? Perhaps, but the arrangement seemed deliberate, almost organized. I spent the morning checking the cabin carefully. Everything else was in order, no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen. I could feel a cold weight pressing in my chest, a growing tension that made my skin crawl. I kept busy, chopping firewood, collecting water, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the unease followed me everywhere. That evening, as I prepared for nightfall, I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the trees, a shadow cast by the setting sun. Then I realized it was a figure, standing at the edge of the tree line, just outside the clearing around the cabin. He was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the forest. He didn't move much, just stood there. My first reaction was disbelief. I blinked several times, but he remained, his presence solid, impossible to ignore. I didn't scream, didn't run. I didn't know if I should, and a part of me feared that movement would provoke him. After a few minutes, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break my ribs. Eventually, darkness fell, and I lit the cabin fire, bolting the doors and windows more carefully than ever. I spent the night sleepless. Every snap, every rustle made me jump. I began checking the locks multiple times an hour. I went through the cabin, making sure there were no gaps, no points of vulnerability. The thought that someone had been watching me all day, waiting, was unbearable. I had underestimated how exposed I was out here, how easy it would be for someone to approach unnoticed. I felt vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years, a raw fear that clawed at me from the inside. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed up as quickly as I could, leaving much of my supplies behind. I kept a baseball bat with me just in case. I planned to hike back to the road, where my car was parked. I didn't need to eat, didn't need to linger. Every step toward the trailhead was tense. My eyes constantly scanned the tree line, every movement making my muscles tense. I could hear the faint sound of the creek nearby, but it was almost comforting compared to the silence of the trees. Halfway to the road, I saw signs again. Footprints in the mud, not mine. They were fresh, running parallel to the trail. I panicked but forced myself to keep moving. My legs felt heavy, my lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. The trail curved, and I caught sight of movement among the trees, just a glimpse, but enough to confirm I was not alone. My mind screamed at me to run, but I maintained a steady pace, careful not to trip or stumble, careful not to make a sound. I could hear footsteps behind me, sometimes distant, sometimes closer. I didn't look back. I refused to. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the clearing where the road was visible. My car was there, just as I had left it, but I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Footprints leading up to the car, circling it, then disappearing into the woods. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking violently. Finally, I got the door unlocked and slid inside, locking it immediately. I started the engine and didn't look back as I drove down the winding road, the forest receding behind me. Every few minutes, I glanced at the mirrors, half expecting to see him, but the road remained empty. When I finally reached the nearest town, I parked in a crowded lot, breathing heavily, shaking from the adrenaline. I stayed in the car for several minutes, trying to calm down, my heart slowly returning to something like normal. I didn't feel relief yet, only the lingering tension, the awareness that someone had been there, had been watching, and could have done anything. I drove straight to the police station, reporting the incident, giving them every detail I could remember. They took my statement seriously, promising to check the area. I knew they might not find anything, but at least it was documented. In the days following, I stayed home, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of my apartment building, every shadow that shifted, brought me back to that week in the cabin. The fear lingered, but so did a sense of relief. I had escaped without injury, without confrontation, and I had learned something vital about myself and the isolation I had once craved. The woods were not the peaceful refuge I had imagined. They were beautiful, yes, but also unpredictable, and out there, someone else could be as hidden as I was exposed. Weeks later, the authorities confirmed that they had found signs of a transient living in the forest nearby. A man who had a history of watching remote cabins, entering when the occupants were away, sometimes stealing, sometimes just observing. It fit perfectly with what I had experienced. I hadn't imagined it. It had been real. And knowing that, I finally allowed myself to feel a cautious sense of closure. I would not return to that cabin, and I would not seek isolation like that again. But I had survived, and that knowledge, hard one, gave me a strange sort of peace. The fear would never fully leave me, but the clarity of having faced it and escaped, unharmed, remained. I had been careful, alert, and lucky, and now I carried that lesson with me wherever I went. I had been planning the trip for months. I needed to get away from everything. The noise, the people, the constant pressure at work, the city that never seemed to sleep or pause. The cabin was far away, off a dirt road that only locals seemed to know, and it was surrounded by miles of dense forest. The isolation was exactly what I wanted, and at first it seemed perfect. The drive itself was long and tiring, but I didn't mind. I liked the quiet hum of my car engine, the way the trees gradually thickened as I drove further away from the town. By the time I reached the last stretch, where the road was more mud than gravel, I realized just how isolated this place really was. My phone had already lost signal an hour back, but I didn't care. I wanted to be disconnected. The cabin was small, old, and built entirely of wood. The kind of place that looked sturdy from a distance but made you wonder if the walls could actually keep the cold or anything else out. The paint was faded, chipped in places, and the roof sagged slightly, giving it a tired, forgotten look. Around the cabin, the trees were thick and tall, and the ground was uneven, littered with leaves, twigs, and the occasional rock. There was a small fire pit just a few feet from the porch, surrounded by old stones. I knew I would need to gather wood soon. The nights were going to be cold. I parked my car and stepped out. The air was heavy and damp, carrying the scent of wet soil and pine. Even though it was early afternoon, the forest cast long shadows, making everything feel dim. I unloaded my bag and took a slow walk around the cabin, inspecting everything. The windows were dirty, some with cracks, but the doors seemed secure. Inside, it smelled like dust, old wood, and a faint hint of mold. The furniture was basic. A small table, a couple of chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a metal stove. I checked the stove first. It was cold, but intact. I knew I would need to start a fire soon to feel comfortable, especially if night came faster than I expected. The first few hours were uneventful. I unpacked my supplies, set up my bed, organized my food, and went outside to collect some wood for the fire. The forest seemed still. No birds, no movement, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. I had expected that. I told myself the forest would settle as the day went on. I built a small fire near the cabin. It took a while because the wood was damp, but eventually the flames grew, giving off warmth and light. Sitting near it, I felt a sense of relief. This was why I had come. Peace, isolation, and the feeling of being completely alone with nothing but nature. Night began to fall faster than I expected. The dimming sunlight through the trees created shadows that seemed to move with every sway of the branches. I made dinner using my small stove, a simple can of beans heated over the flame. The sound of the stove ticking and the smell of cooked food filled the cabin, making it feel a little more like home. I ate quickly, cleaning up every scrap of food. I didn't want to attract any animals, though the nearest town was miles away. The forest could hold its own dangers, and I respected that. I went outside to throw my garbage into a small pit I had dug. That's when I first noticed it. A set of footprints in the mud near the cabin. They weren't deep, but they were clear. Human, not animal. I froze, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old. My heart started to beat faster. I didn't know if anyone else could have been around. There weren't supposed to be any other people for miles. I followed the trail cautiously, keeping the fire in sight. The footprints disappeared quickly, leaving only broken twigs and flattened leaves. I told myself it could have been hunters or hikers passing by earlier, but a cold knot of unease had settled in my stomach. The rest of the night was long. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind rattling the roof, the trees groaning, the occasional snap of a branch far off in the darkness. I made sure the doors were locked, the windows latched, and the fire was steady. I didn't sleep much. When I did, it was light, disturbed by the slightest creak or rustle. At some point, I thought I heard voices far away, muffled and indistinct, but I couldn't be sure. The thought of someone else in the forest, moving silently, waiting, was unsettling. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Morning brought light, but not relief. The footprints had multiplied. Around the cabin, near the woods, there were more, showing a circuitous path, as if someone had been circling. I checked my phone again. No signal. The closest neighbor was a few miles away, if even that. Panic bubbled quietly under my skin. I considered packing up and leaving, but something made me stay. I needed to understand. I spent the next day preparing. I gathered extra firewood, moved heavy objects near the doors, and created makeshift barricades with furniture. I checked every window, every latch. I stayed near the fire most of the day, watching the surrounding woods for any signs of movement. Shadows seemed to flit through the trees, but I couldn't tell if it was wildlife or something else. I stayed alert, constantly listening, constantly watching. By the second night, the feeling of being watched became suffocating. Every small sound, a branch snapping, a rustle in the leaves, made my heart leap. I kept the fire burning bright, stacked extra logs, and stayed close to the center of the cabin. Sleep was impossible. I started marking the perimeter, checking windows, making sure nothing was out of place. The footprints had returned, closer to the cabin this time, almost circling it in the mud. Whoever it was, they had been there during the day and I hadn't noticed. At some point, I realized I had to face it. I grabbed my flashlight, my hunting knife, and slowly stepped outside, circling the cabin carefully. The footprints led into the forest, deeper than I had ever gone. I followed them cautiously, moving step by step. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches brushing my face, leaves sticking to my clothes. The prints stopped suddenly near a large oak. The ground was disturbed, as if someone had been digging. My stomach twisted. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, scanning for movement. There was nothing, just the heavy, oppressive stillness of the forest. I stayed outside for a long time, circling, checking, making sure no one was lurking. Eventually, exhaustion forced me back inside. I locked the doors, reinforced the windows, and kept the fire blazing. I realized that I had survived this long by keeping alert, by trusting my instincts, and by preparing for anything. The fear was real, but so was my ability to protect myself. The next morning, I packed my essentials, prepared to leave, and started driving back the same way I had come. The forest felt less threatening in the daylight, though my eyes constantly flicked to the treeline. I didn't see anyone following me, and the footprints had vanished as if they had never been there. When I finally reached the main road, the town, and a place with cell service, relief washed over me like a tide. I called the local authorities, explaining what I had found near the cabin, and they noted it down. I knew they might not do much, but I felt safer just reporting it. In the end, I realized something important. The fear I felt wasn't just from the possibility of someone being near the cabin. It was the isolation, the unknown, the vulnerability. By staying calm, by observing, and by trusting my instincts, I had survived. The cabin was scary, the forest intimidating, and the unknown terrifying, but I had made it through. I drove home slowly, stopping at a small diner along the way to collect myself, breathing deeply, feeling the tension leaving my body in slow waves. The experience left a mark on me, but it also taught me resilience, caution, and the importance of preparation. Even now, I think about that cabin. I think about the footprints, the forest, the feeling of being watched, and the fire that kept me alive. It's a memory that comes back vividly, a reminder that fear can be managed, that preparation matters, and that facing something frightening doesn't always mean you're weak. It can mean you're human, aware, and alive. I had been driving for hours through winding, narrow roads, the kind that seemed to get smaller and more isolated the further I went. My GPS had given up about 30 minutes back, and I was relying solely on the vague directions scribbled down from a website I had stumbled upon. They said the cabin was remote, untouched, off the grid, perfect for someone who needed time alone. That someone was me. I had been overworked, overstressed, and exhausted by the endless demands of city life. The idea of disappearing into the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, felt like the only thing that could save me. The sun had begun to drop below the horizon as I turned off the main road onto a dirt track that seemed to vanish into a wall of trees. The forest around me grew thicker, darker, the canopy blotting out the remaining light. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to ignore the way the road narrowed into a single lane with deep ruts on either side. Every few seconds, the tires hit a rock or a patch of loose soil, sending a shudder through the car. Eventually, I saw it, the cabin. It wasn't what I had imagined. The pictures online had made it look cozy, almost picturesque, but in reality, it seemed as though it had been abandoned for years. The wood was weathered to a gray, and patches of moss clung to the roof. The windows were dirty, some with cracks, and the small porch sagged under its own weight. A feeling of unease crept into me, but I brushed it off. I had driven here for solitude, and solitude was exactly what I was about to get. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The air was different here, cooler, heavier, and carrying the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of small animals and the distant call of a bird. I grabbed my bag, which contained food, water, a flashlight, and some basic supplies, and made my way up the rickety steps to the porch. Each step creaked loudly under my weight. I paused for a moment, listening. There was nothing but the quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that makes you feel watched, as though every sound you make echoes farther than it should. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew and old wood. Dust covered every surface. The furniture, sparse as it was, seemed to have been left in a hurry years ago. I set my bag down and moved toward the fireplace. There was a stack of wood, old but dry enough to burn, and I set to work making a small fire. The flames cast long shadows across the walls, and the room felt suddenly warmer, safer. I unpacked my things and arranged them carefully, making the small space feel a little more like home. Night fell fully, and with it came the full depth of isolation. The wind moved through the trees outside, brushing against the walls and rattling the windows. Every crack in the old wood seemed amplified in the darkness. I tried to read, tried to watch the way the fire moved and danced, but my mind kept wandering. Every snap from the fireplace, every groan of the building settling, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was normal, that old cabins creak and moan, but the anxiety didn't leave. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise. First, I thought it was the wind. Then I heard it again. A scraping sound, soft, deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. I froze, straining my ears. It was coming from the side of the building, near the back porch. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window, but I saw nothing. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the trunks of the trees, the brush, and the forest floor, but no sign of anything moving. I convinced myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. But I couldn't. My heart wouldn't stop racing. Sleep eventually claimed me, though it was light and fitful. The next morning, I went outside to explore, hoping that daylight would make everything seem less ominous. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. I walked along the edge of the trees, noting the paths animals had made, the occasional bird hopping through the underbrush. The cabin seemed harmless in the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was watching, waiting. As the day went on, I settled into a routine. I gathered more firewood, explored the immediate area, and tried to relax. But the tension never really left me. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth, made me startle. By evening, I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. The scraping sound from the previous night returned, louder this time. It was at the back of the cabin, as though someone or something was trying to move the boards. I crept to the window and shined my flashlight, And that's when I saw it. A shadow moving behind the trees. I held my breath, straining to see what it was. It wasn't an animal. I could make out the shape of a person, hunched over and moving slowly, deliberately. Panic surged through me. I retreated from the window, my mind racing. Whoever it was couldn't see me inside. The windows were dirty and the fire dimmed to embers. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, holding it tightly, and waited. The figure stayed there for what felt like hours, moving intermittently, never leaving, always lurking just beyond the clearing. As night deepened, the figure finally left. I stayed awake, torchlight on, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn. When I ventured outside, the footprints in the soft earth were unmistakable. Someone had been circling the cabin, close enough to touch the walls, moving in a pattern that suggested they were observing me. I felt violated, exposed in a way that made my skin crawl. Over the next few days, I remained on high alert. Every sound seemed magnified, every movement suspicious. I stayed inside as much as possible, keeping the fire going, keeping the doors locked, checking the perimeter every daylight hour. I realized that I couldn't stay here like this. I was trapped in isolation, and I was no longer alone in the woods. Someone had found this cabin, and they were watching. I began planning my escape. I studied the terrain, noting the best routes back to the main road, the thickest parts of the forest that might hide me, and the points where I could get a clear line of sight if someone tried to follow me. I packed my bag, leaving behind anything heavy or unnecessary, and prepared to leave under the cover of darkness. The night I chose to leave, I waited until the figure was no longer around. The wind was calm, the sky clear. I moved quickly but quietly, sticking to the trees and shadows, avoiding open areas as much as possible. My heart was pounding in my chest with every snap of a twig underfoot. After what felt like hours, I reached the main dirt track, and then the lights of the distant town appeared in the distance. Relief surged through me, but I kept my pace, never looking back. When I finally reached the edge of the forest and got into a gas station to call for help, the adrenaline that had kept me moving finally left me, and exhaustion hit hard. I reported the incident to the authorities, and they later confirmed that the area had a history of break-ins targeting cabins, especially ones far from the main roads. They told me I had been lucky. That knowledge didn't erase the fear, but it gave me something concrete to hold on to. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost. It was just a human threat. In the weeks that followed, I avoided the woods entirely. The idea of going back was unbearable. But I also learned something important. The city, the noise, the chaos, the stress, it wasn't necessarily the problem. Isolation could be just as dangerous if you weren't careful. I realized that freedom in the wild came with responsibility, vigilance, and respect for the unpredictability of the world and the people in it. Looking back, I still think about that cabin, still remember the cold wind through the trees, the shadows that seemed to stretch forever, the sense of being watched. But I also remember the relief of seeing the town lights, the comfort of safety, the knowledge that I could survive fear by staying calm, planning carefully, and trusting my instincts. The memory is vivid, but it no longer terrifies me. I learned to carry caution with me, not paranoia, and to respect the unknown in a way that keeps me alive and aware. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted a real escape from the city, from the constant noise, the lights that never turned off, and the endless movement of people I didn't know and didn't care to know. The idea of a cabin deep in the forest, away from everything, was perfect. I found it online, a small wooden cabin, isolated but still accessible by car, though the last stretch of road was dirt and rough. The pictures showed nothing but trees, a lake nearby, and the cabin itself, small, sturdy, wooden, with smoke curling from the chimney in some of the photos. The owner said it was quiet, that you could hear nothing but the wind and the birds. That was exactly what I wanted. I left early on a Friday morning. My car was packed with a backpack, groceries, some firewood, water, a few cans of fuel for the small stove, and a box of emergency supplies. The drive was long but peaceful. I took back roads for most of it, winding through narrow lanes surrounded by dense trees. I passed a few other cabins, but most of the houses were empty or looked abandoned. I arrived just as the sun was low in the sky. The cabin was even smaller than I expected, but cozy looking. There was a wooden porch, a stack of firewood neatly piled to one side, and the smell of damp pine all around. I parked my car on the rough driveway, noting the uneven ground. The tires sank slightly into the soft soil, and I made a mental note to be careful in case it rained. I opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and smelled of wood and old pine needles. Dust covered the floor in some corners, and a few cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams. There was a small kitchen area, a tiny table with 2 chairs, a living area with a worn couch, and a single bedroom at the back. The bathroom was tiny, with an old shower that looked barely functional. I set down my things and went straight to the stove. I wanted a fire before nightfall. Lighting it was harder than I expected. The old matches didn't catch at first, and the kindling was damp. Eventually, though, flames licked the dry wood, and warmth spread through the room. I sat for a while, watching the smoke rise and drift out through the chimney, listening to the faint crackle of the fire. Outside, the sky was turning orange and then purple. The forest was already swallowing the light. Shadows stretched long across the small clearing around the cabin. After dinner, I decided to walk down to the lake. There was a small path behind the cabin, barely visible in the fading light. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the smell of wet earth and leaves was strong. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds were calling, no insects were buzzing. It felt empty, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The lake appeared after about 15 minutes of walking. Its surface was smooth, almost mirror-like, reflecting the last traces of light in the sky. I stayed there for a while, feeling a calm that I hadn't felt in years. When I returned to the cabin, the darkness had fully arrived. I lit a few lanterns I had brought along and tried to relax. But then I noticed something. There was a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the trees, or maybe a branch falling. But it was rhythmic, soft, but deliberate, like footsteps. I froze. The cabin was small. I could hear everything. The steps were slow, heavy, and they seemed to circle the cabin. I checked all the windows. Nothing. The door was locked. My heart was pounding, and I realized I didn't even know the exact layout of the area. There was no neighbor for miles. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was just my imagination. I decided to stay up for a while, keeping the fire alive. Every now and then, I heard the footsteps again, always outside, always moving. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a corner, listening, watching shadows from the fire flicker across the walls. I convinced myself it had to be an animal. The next morning, in daylight, I went outside to check. The ground around the cabin was soft, and I could see footprints. They weren't large, maybe human-sized, but they weren't mine. They led around the cabin and then into the forest. There were no other marks, no tire tracks, nothing to indicate a vehicle. Just the footprints. My stomach sank. Whoever had been walking around my cabin the night before had done so quietly and left no obvious signs of a campsite or vehicle. I debated leaving immediately, but the nearest town was hours away. I decided to stay, but I started taking precautions. I reinforced the door, made sure all windows were locked, and moved my backpack closer to the door with my supplies inside. I even laid a few of the firewood logs in positions where I could use them if I had to defend myself. I tried to keep my routine normal, cooking breakfast, cleaning the cabin, checking the surroundings. But every evening, the footsteps returned, always circling the cabin, always stopping when I looked out. On the third night, the sound changed. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. There was something scraping against the wood of the cabin. It was faint at first, like a branch brushing, but then it became louder, deliberate. Someone or something was testing the doors and windows. I stayed still, heart racing, listening as the sound moved around the cabin. I realized it could be someone trying to break in. Panic settled over me. I grabbed the backpack, keeping the flashlight ready, and decided I had to leave before it got worse. But when I stepped outside, The forest was still. Nothing moved. No footprints, no figure, nothing. I ran back inside, locking the door and windows again. The next day, I decided to drive to the nearest town. I didn't care about sightseeing or exploring anymore. I wanted to be somewhere populated, somewhere safe. Packing my things, I noticed the forest felt different in daylight. The shadows were sharper. The paths I had walked were less inviting. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove slowly along the dirt road, eyes constantly on the treeline. At one point, I thought I saw someone standing between the trees, but when I blinked, they were gone. My heart was pounding again. I drove faster, the gravel crunching under the tires, the car bouncing over small rocks. As I left the dense forest, the road opened into a clearing. I looked in the rearview mirror and thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. Couldn't be sure. My pulse was racing, and I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. When I finally pulled into a gas station, I realized how tense I had been. Every muscle in my body ached from fear and stress. I filled the tank, bought water, and sat in the car for a while, just trying to calm down. I told myself that maybe it had been a trespasser, maybe someone curious about the cabin, but at least I was out. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. I called the owner and told them what happened. They were quiet on the phone, almost dismissive. They said it was rare for anyone to stay there long-term, that the forest was empty for miles. They offered to refund my booking, but I refused. I realized I didn't want to go back. The cabin, the forest, the quiet, it wasn't worth the fear I felt. A week later, I learned from a local news site that there had been a series of break-ins at remote cabins in the area. People had been watching the houses, sometimes sleeping outside, sometimes breaking in. No one was ever caught. I felt a chill when I read it. The footprints, the circling, the scraping on the wood. It had all been real. I had been lucky to leave when I did. After that, I avoided remote areas for a long time. I still love nature, but I now realize that isolation has a real cost. It gives you peace, yes, but it also gives fear space to grow. I started going on hikes during the day, staying in small towns nearby, never venturing into deep woods alone. And though I still remember the cabin, the forest, and the footsteps at night, I also remember the relief of leaving, of seeing the road open ahead of me, and knowing I had made it out safe. That clarity, that return to safety, became something I treasured more than the isolation I had once sought. I had been planning the cabin trip for months, checking maps, weather reports, and packing lists repeatedly. I wanted something quiet, isolated, a place far from the constant noise of the city, somewhere I could spend a week alone, reading, hiking, and just existing without distractions. The cabin I rented was deep in a forested valley, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through thick pine trees. The GPS signal was weak there, which was part of the appeal. No emails, no notifications, nothing but me and the woods. I drove for hours, my car bouncing over uneven terrain, tires crunching over gravel and loose rocks, until finally, the trees parted enough for me to see the cabin. It was old but sturdy, a simple wooden structure with a steep roof, a small porch, and a chimney that hadn't seen smoke in months. Around it, the forest stretched endlessly, shadows forming patterns as the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the quiet settle in, almost physically pressing against me. The cabin smelled of dust, old wood, and a faint trace of dampness from previous rains. I unpacked slowly, laying out my things carefully. Sleeping bag, lanterns, food, water, notebooks, a first aid kit, and an emergency radio. There was no phone signal at all, no Wi-Fi, just the occasional distant bird call and the whisper of wind in the trees. I tried to focus on that, tried to convince myself that being completely cut off was relaxing. The first night was calm. I made a small fire in the fireplace, using wood stacked neatly in the corner. Flames flickered against the walls, casting long shadows across the room. I cooked a simple meal on the old stove, feeling a strange satisfaction at the effort of doing everything myself. Afterward, I sat by the fire, sipping water from a metal cup and watching sparks rise toward the ceiling. The forest outside was quiet, dark, and imposing, but I felt safe. I had locked the doors, checked the windows, and I had my flashlight and a small hatchet nearby. Sleep came eventually, heavy and deep, the sounds of the night blending with the warmth of the fire dying in the hearth. The second day was when things began to feel slightly off. I had gone for a long hike, following a narrow path through the trees. The trail was mostly flat at first, then dipped sharply into a small ravine. I crossed a creek by stepping on uneven stones slick with moss. Everything was beautiful, almost mesmerizing, but I began noticing small details I hadn't seen before. Broken branches and patterns that suggested something had passed through recently, deeper footprints than mine in the muddy soil, and an occasional rustling that didn't sound like a bird or the wind. At first, I dismissed it, telling myself it was probably a deer or a fox, but the feeling of being watched persisted. When I returned to the cabin, the sun had already begun to lower in the sky, and the shadows between the trees seemed longer, darker, and more solid than before. That night, I was restless. I kept hearing noises outside, small at first, twigs snapping, leaves crunching under weight. Every time I got up to check, there was nothing. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet immediately after the noise, as if it was holding its breath. I double-checked the doors and windows, then sat by the dying fire, trying to focus on reading. But the tension grew, pressing in on my chest. I lay down eventually, but sleep was shallow. Every snap of a branch sounded like someone walking on the porch. Every gust of wind through the chimney sounded like a footstep in the hall. By the third day, I realized I wasn't alone. I woke before dawn to the sound of heavy breathing outside the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear, but it stopped as soon as I shifted my weight. My stomach sank, a cold pit forming in my chest. I checked the perimeter outside, walking the entire boundary of the cabin. There were footprints, large, heavy, and unmistakably human, circling the building in a way that made me realize I had been watched while sleeping. Panic set in, but I forced myself to remain calm. I cleaned the area near the windows, set small traps with cans to make noise if someone stepped near, and secured the door with a makeshift bar from the fireplace. I tried to tell myself it was probably a hiker or someone exploring the forest, but the footprints were too fresh and too close. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, checking the perimeter every hour. The isolation felt thicker now, oppressive. Sunlight barely touched the ground outside the cabin because the trees were so dense. I spent most of the day organizing my supplies and trying to keep my mind busy. I kept the hatchet near the bed, the fire in the hearth burning steadily to give me some comfort. Shadows moved outside constantly, and every movement made me tense. At one point, I swore I saw a figure standing beyond the tree line, but when I blinked, there was nothing. My rational mind screamed that it was just my imagination, but the unease had settled deep in my bones. On the fifth day, it escalated. I was cooking a small lunch on the stove when I heard a loud bang on the front door. I froze, listening. Another bang, harder this time. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed the hatchet, ready, and cautiously peered through the window. Nothing. No one. The footsteps outside were faint, retreating into the distance. I spent the entire afternoon checking and rechecking the cabin, ensuring that no other doors or windows had been tampered with. I couldn't tell if the person outside was still in the forest or had left entirely, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. That night was the worst. I barely slept. Every little sound, every creak of the old cabin, felt magnified. I thought I could hear whispering carried by the wind, though I knew that was impossible. The temperature dropped sharply, even with the fire burning. I could see my breath in the cold air, and the shadows from the flickering flames seemed to move in impossible ways. My mind ran through every scenario. Someone breaking in, someone hiding in the forest, or being trapped here until help arrived. The reality of being utterly isolated hit me hard. I was a small, fragile human in the middle of an immense forest, completely vulnerable. The sixth day, I decided I had to leave. The dirt road I had driven in on was the only way out, and the thought of walking it with someone potentially watching me made my stomach twist. I packed quickly, making sure nothing was left behind. As I stepped outside, I noticed something new. Fresh tire tracks leading up to the cabin, as if someone had been here recently and driven off. My blood ran cold. I checked the forest in all directions, and for the first time, I truly understood the danger of the isolation. I could not see anyone, but I could feel eyes on me, could sense movement just out of sight. I started walking down the road slowly, staying alert. Every sound made me jump. Leaves rustled behind me, branches cracked under weight. I kept my eyes on the tree line, scanning for any sign of movement. The sun was low, casting long shadows, and I realized that darkness would make the hike even more dangerous. I pushed myself to move faster, my boots crunching over loose gravel, my pack heavy on my shoulders. I paused occasionally to catch my breath, and every time I did, I felt a presence nearby, just beyond my vision. My mind raced, calculating possibilities, weighing chances of survival. After what felt like hours, I saw the outline of my car. Relief flooded me, but I was still cautious, scanning the tree line as I approached. My car was exactly where I had left it, no signs of tampering, but the tracks outside had me on edge. I loaded my backpack into the trunk, checked my doors, and got in. I started the engine, listening to it roar to life as if it were my only protection. I drove slowly, constantly watching the trees on either side of the road. The forest seemed endless, oppressive, like it could swallow me whole if I let my attention lapse. Finally, I reached the main road, paved and familiar. The change was almost jarring. The sounds of civilization, the light from street lamps, and distant cars. I pulled over to catch my breath, staring at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. There was nothing, only darkness fading behind me. I drove home carefully, exhausted, my muscles tense from days of heightened alertness. When I finally reached the city, the constant noise and movement felt almost suffocating, but I was safe. In the days after, I checked the news for reports of break-ins, missing hikers, or suspicious activity near the forest. Nothing. I never learned who had been there or why. The thought lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I couldn't convince myself it was imagination. Not after the footprints, the banging, the presence I had felt pressing around the cabin. But I did know one thing clearly. Isolation in a remote place, without backup or communication, can turn even a serene cabin in the woods into a terrifying trap. The experience changed me. I no longer looked at the forest as peaceful or inviting. I remembered every step I took, every shadow, every sound, and the relief I felt seeing that familiar road. I realized that survival often relies less on luck and more on caution, preparation, and the willingness to leave a place even when you want to stay. Months later, I returned to the cabin once, briefly, during daylight, just to see it again. It looked exactly the same, quiet, empty, and inviting, but I didn't step inside. I stayed on the road, took a photograph from a distance, and left. I never returned to that forest, never sought isolation there again. I had learned that some places, no matter how beautiful, are safer when admired from afar. The memory of the footprints, the banging, and the suffocating quiet never left me. But I survived. I made it home, and that knowledge, that clarity, was something no fear or isolation could ever take from me. I had planned the trip for months. The cabin was tucked deep into the forest, far from the nearest road, far from anyone else. I had been seeking isolation, a place to escape the noise of the city, the endless demands at work, the faint hum of human life that followed me everywhere. The forest promised quiet, and the cabin promised safety, or at least that's what I told myself. The first day was calm, even beautiful. The road leading to the cabin narrowed as I drove, eventually becoming a gravel path lined with thick trees. Pines and oaks towered overhead, blocking the sun in places, leaving long stretches of shadow that made the air feel cooler than the late afternoon should have allowed. When I arrived, I was struck by how small the cabin was. It was simple, built of rough-hewn logs with a steep roof and a single chimney. A stack of firewood rested against the side wall. The windows were dirty, slightly opaque, giving the place a weathered, neglected look, but inside it smelled clean. The wood floors had been swept, the counters wiped, and the fireplace, though empty of ashes, looked ready to use. It was perfect. I unloaded my bags, arranged the things I had brought, and went outside to stretch my legs. The first night I built a fire. I had come prepared with plenty of dry wood, kindling, and matches. The flames danced across the room, casting long shadows on the walls, and I felt a strange kind of comfort in the firelight. The wind blew against the cabin, making the roof creak and the walls groan. But inside I felt safe. I made dinner, a simple meal of canned soup, and then sat in a chair near the fire, watching the flames and listening to the forest. Owls hooted in the distance, the branches rattled against each other, and occasionally, a sharp crack sounded in the woods. I thought nothing of it at first until the next day. I had planned a short hike, a loop that would take me around a small creek and back to the cabin. The trail was uneven, littered with roots and fallen branches, and I had to keep my eyes on the ground as much as the path ahead. Birds darted through the trees, their wings flashing in the sun, and every so often, I caught movement at the edge of my vision. I told myself it was deer or squirrels or my imagination. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. A single footprint in the dirt path near the door. It wasn't mine. I had taken off my boots at the door, and I knew the mud from the hike hadn't reached that spot. I knelt down and examined it. The size suggested an adult human, but the shape was off, elongated, with toes splayed strangely. I frowned. Maybe it was a local hunter or someone hiking nearby. I wasn't worried yet, but there was a prickling in the back of my neck I couldn't ignore. That night I slept lightly. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the log walls. I woke several times, certain I had heard footsteps outside, just beyond the circle of light cast by the fireplace. Each time I strained to listen, the forest answered with nothing but rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a branch. I kept thinking I saw shapes moving just beyond the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. By morning, I felt exhausted, my body tense from the fear that wouldn't let go. The next day, I explored more of the forest. I tried to convince myself that being alone was exactly what I wanted, that I had chosen this. I found the creek I had seen from the cabin's small deck, and followed it upstream for nearly an hour. The water was cold and clear, and the forest thickened as I walked. Here I realized there was no one, not even signs of humans, just trees, rocks, and the constant, quiet rush of water. I felt a strange calm in that emptiness, but the calm didn't last. When I returned, I saw that the door to the cabin was slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had locked it. My stomach dropped. I approached slowly, my eyes scanning the surrounding woods. There was no one. Inside, nothing was obviously disturbed, though the fireplace had ash scattered around as if someone had poked at it. I tried to convince myself it was wind, or perhaps I had been careless, but the unease in my chest grew heavier. That night, I made sure the doors and windows were locked and bolted. I kept a hatchet on the floor near my bed, and a small flashlight on the nightstand. Every noise felt louder than it should have. Every shadow seemed to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours passed slowly. I eventually fell into a fitful sleep, only to wake suddenly to a sharp noise at the window. Something had tapped, lightly, twice. My heart raced. I turned on the flashlight. Nothing. I told myself it was a branch, the wind, anything but what my mind feared. By the third day, the tension was unbearable. I ventured further from the cabin, trying to distract myself. I found an old, overgrown trail, once used perhaps by hunters or loggers. The path was littered with broken branches, and every step I took seemed to echo through the forest. I could feel eyes on me, and every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I heard someone whispering. I froze, staring into the dense trees. The sound stopped. I kept walking, my pace quickening, until I convinced myself I had imagined it. When I returned, I found more signs of intrusion. Something had been in the cabin again. A chair was slightly turned, a jar knocked over, and dirt tracked across the floor. Panic surged through me. I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with someone or something, entering my sanctuary while I was away. I gathered my things quickly, packed my backpack, and prepared to leave. Before I could get into the car, I noticed footprints leading into the woods. Human footprints. I traced them cautiously, heart hammering. They were fresh. Whoever had been here was still nearby. My first instinct was to run, but something made me follow the trail slowly, carefully. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches scratching at my arms and face, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and fallen leaves. I followed the tracks for nearly an hour. They led to a small clearing where I found something that made my blood run cold. A makeshift campsite, recently abandoned. A small fire pit, a tarp, footprints circling it. Whoever had been here had watched me, had been close enough to see when I left the cabin. I realized then that this wasn't random trespassing. This person had been planning, waiting, observing. Fear pushed me into action. I returned to the cabin carefully, packed everything I could carry, and left. I didn't look back. The drive back to the main road was tense. Every shadow along the gravel path seemed to move. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. But eventually, the forest thinned, and the sounds of civilization grew louder. Cars passed, people walked by, and the constant background hum of human life returned. Once home, I changed all my locks, installed new security cameras, and reported the cabin intrusion to the local authorities. They said it was likely a transient, someone living off the grid, but the details didn't matter to me. What mattered was that I had survived, that I had left the cabin before something worse could happen. Over time, I was able to think of the cabin trip as an adventure, a test of my instincts, my courage, and my awareness. The fear had been real, palpable, but I had emerged on the other side, alive, unharmed, and more cautious than ever. It took weeks to shake the memory of the footprints, the creaking walls, the tapping on the window. But eventually, the forest became just a forest again, a place of beauty rather than danger. I still go hiking, still seek quiet in nature, but I always carry a sense of caution, a reminder of the time I was truly alone in the woods, a reminder of the moment when silence itself could feel threatening. That cabin taught me that fear is not always in stories or shadows. It can be real, present, and close enough to touch if you're not careful. And it also taught me that attention, preparation, and awareness can carry you through situations that seem impossible, leaving you intact on the other side. I had been planning the trip for months, telling myself it would be a quiet retreat, a place to disconnect from everything and everyone. Work had been overwhelming for weeks. The constant calls, emails, and deadlines had left me drained. I needed a place to think, to rest, and to feel normal again. When I found the small cabin listed online, tucked deep in the mountains, it seemed perfect. Remote enough to avoid anyone, small enough to feel manageable, and surrounded by dense forest. The photos made it look cozy. Dark wood paneling, a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a lofted bedroom. It wasn't luxurious, but I didn't need luxury. I needed quiet. I left late in the morning, driving a long stretch of road that became smaller and narrower the further I went. Eventually, the pavement gave way to a gravel path. The trees grew taller and denser. The light seemed to dim under the heavy canopy, though the sun was still high in the sky. I parked my car near the cabin after a long, winding drive. The smell of wet earth and pine filled my nose. The cabin was exactly like the pictures, maybe even better in person. There was a small clearing around it, surrounded by thick trees that obscured everything beyond. I carried my bags inside and set them down. The cabin was quiet, almost unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears until you noticed the faintest sounds. The creak of the floorboards, the wind brushing against the windows, the distant rustle of branches. I spent the first hour unpacking and exploring the cabin. The loft bedroom was small, with a low ceiling, a mattress, and a few blankets. The kitchen had basic supplies, a small stove, and a sink with a barely adequate supply of water. The living room had a stone fireplace, empty but ready to be filled. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and must, but it wasn't unpleasant. I unpacked my bag slowly, trying to settle in, but a nagging feeling crept over me. Something was off. Not in a supernatural way, there were no ghosts, no eerie figures, but the isolation was heavy. It felt unnatural to be completely alone with only the forest around me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood from the surrounding area, stacking it neatly by the fireplace. The forest was thick and full of noise. Birds, insects, and the occasional snap of a branch. I noticed how easily sounds traveled through the trees. Every small noise seemed louder, amplified by the silence of the cabin. By the time I returned with enough wood to last the evening, the sun was low. Shadows stretched across the clearing, and the trees looked darker, almost black. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, watching the flames flicker and illuminate the room. It was calming, hypnotic almost. I made a simple meal and ate quietly, the occasional crack of the fire filling the silence. As night fell, the forest outside seemed to change. The sounds grew sharper, more deliberate. A branch snapping in the distance made me jump, and every rustle caused a spike of adrenaline. I told myself it was just animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote, but it felt different, closer. I locked the cabin door, checked the windows, and double-checked the fire. I tried to read for a while, but the words blurred on the page. My mind kept wandering to the noises outside, to the dense forest that surrounded me. Every so often, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the window, but when I looked closer, nothing was there. Sleep was difficult. I laid in the lofted bed, blankets pulled tight, staring at the low ceiling. The occasional sound of wind or a branch brushing against the cabin kept me alert. Around midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves just outside the clearing. My heart jumped, my stomach twisted. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. Not the sound of an animal. I had lived in rural areas before. I knew animal sounds, but deliberate, heavy steps. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps circled the cabin, slow, methodical. I knew I had to be careful. The cabin had no phone signal, no easy way to call for help. I grabbed the small kitchen knife I had brought for emergencies and slowly moved to the living room window. Peering through the glass, I saw nothing. The firelight cast long shadows across the clearing, but nothing moved. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the forest around me. The steps continued at irregular intervals, sometimes far away, sometimes just at the edge of the clearing. Sleep was impossible. I sat in the living room, knife in hand, fire crackling, eyes constantly scanning the darkness outside. The hours dragged. Every sound made me flinch. The wind sounded like voices. A small branch broke nearby, and I jumped, heart racing. I realized the person or people outside might not have seen me yet, and I didn't know if they were dangerous, but my instincts screamed that they were. I could only stay quiet, stay hidden, and hope they moved on. I considered leaving, running back to the car and driving down the gravel road, but I didn't know if they were watching it. The thought of stepping outside filled me with terror. At dawn, the forest seemed quieter, almost peaceful again. The steps had stopped hours ago, though I didn't relax. I waited until the sun was fully up before venturing outside. The clearing was empty, but there were signs someone had been there. Footprints in the dirt, broken branches, and trampled leaves. Whoever had been circling the cabin had left at some point during the night. I examined the tracks. They were heavy boots, large and deliberate. I realized how close they had come to the cabin without me seeing them. I spent the next day cautiously moving around the area, taking mental notes of escape routes and possible hiding spots. I decided I couldn't stay another night without a plan. I packed my things, gathered the firewood, and prepared to leave. I double-checked the cabin, making sure doors were locked and nothing was left behind. The drive back down the gravel path was tense. Every shadow along the road made me flinch. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. I drove slowly, alert to everything. When I finally reached the main road, relief washed over me. The isolation that had seemed so inviting the day before now felt dangerous, suffocating. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station far from the mountains, the safety of other people around me. I reported the footprints and the unusual activity to the local ranger station. They told me that while the area was mostly safe, there had been occasional reports of people camping illegally or trespassing in remote areas. No one had ever been harmed, but it was clear that someone had been watching my cabin the night before. Looking back, I realized how naive I had been. The cabin itself wasn't scary, the isolation was. The forest wasn't malevolent, but it created a situation where someone could approach unnoticed, and I had been completely unprepared. The fear, the adrenaline, the constant sense of being watched had made the night feel endless. I understood why people carried firearms or at least some form of protection in remote areas. I had learned, the hard way, that isolation could be as dangerous as any predator. In the following days, I recovered from the trip physically, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Every quiet moment at home reminded me of the silence of the forest, the weight of being completely alone with unknown people nearby. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and more respectful of the wilderness. I learned that being alone, even in what seems like a peaceful retreat, carries risks that are easy to underestimate. The experience changed the way I approached outdoor trips, and I never again sought isolation without proper precautions. The story of that cabin trip is one I remember vividly. I don't speak about it often because it sounds unbelievable, almost like a thriller, but it was real. Every step of the way, every sound, every shadow was real, and I survived, but not without a deep understanding of the quiet dangers that exist when you're truly alone. The ending was clear. I made it home safely, but I returned with lessons that no amount of reading or planning could have taught me. The forest hadn't changed. I had, and I would never underestimate the solitude of the wilderness again. I had been planning this cabin trip for months, a solitary escape from the city and its constant noise. The idea of spending a week alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional wildlife, was supposed to be calming, restorative, something that would let me breathe again after a year of work and endless obligations. I found a small, secluded cabin on a private rental website, one that claimed it had no neighbors for miles and offered complete privacy. It was a tiny place, just 2 rooms with a wood stove for heating, a small kitchen, and a single bathroom. The photos looked perfect. The idea of isolation thrilled me, and I had been looking forward to it for months. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. The road grew narrower the further I went, until eventually it became a dirt track winding through the forest. There were no signs, no other houses, nothing but the sound of my tires crunching on gravel and the occasional bird overhead. It was quiet in a way that felt unnatural after the constant hum of the city. By the time I arrived, the sun was low on the horizon, the sky burning orange through the trees. I parked in a small clearing in front of the cabin and got out, stretching my stiff legs and taking in the smell of pine and earth. The air was crisp, and a cold wind brushed against my skin, carrying with it the faint scent of damp wood and leaves. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined, with weathered wood siding and a little porch that sagged slightly under its own weight. There was a single door with a rusty handle, a couple of windows with dusty panes, and an old, half-broken lamp by the entrance. I unlocked the door with the code the owner had sent me and stepped inside. The smell of musty wood and old insulation hit me immediately. The cabin had been cleaned, I assumed, but it carried the weight of years of solitude. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and as I walked through the small living area, I noticed a layer of dust on the shelves, a few old magazines, and a broken chair in the corner. I set down my bags, took a deep breath, and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. I spent the next hour unpacking, getting my supplies in order, and inspecting the cabin. The kitchen was tiny, with an old stove, a small refrigerator that hummed loudly, and a sink with weak water pressure. The bathroom was functional but grimy, the tiles cracked in places. The bedroom had a small bed with a thin mattress and a faded blanket. Everything felt fragile, like it could collapse if I wasn't careful. But it was mine for the week, and the thought was supposed to be comforting. The first night was quiet, too quiet. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath. I kept the lights low, reading on my phone and trying to calm my nerves. Every now and then, I thought I heard something brushing against the cabin walls, but I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or the wind moving through the trees. I slept fitfully, waking to small noises that made me sit up in bed, heart racing, listening for whatever it was. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The forest stretched in all directions, dense and thick, the trees tall enough that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. I walked along faint trails, taking in the sounds of birds, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. It felt peaceful at first, almost hypnotic, but then I realized how easily I could get lost. The paths all looked the same after a few hundred meters. I made a mental note to stick close to the cabin, but I also wanted to see as much as I could while I was here. By the evening, I returned to the cabin tired but satisfied. I built a small fire in the wood stove, using dry logs I had stacked outside, and sat in the flickering light. That was when the unease started to deepen. The noises outside had changed. Before, it had been simple forest sounds, birds, wind, small animals. Now there was something more deliberate, a snapping of twigs, but not random. Something was moving closer, and it didn't sound like any animal I knew. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer or some other small creature, but the pace and the rhythm were too steady, too careful to be accidental. I checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked, latched. Still, I felt exposed. My phone had weak signal, almost non-existent, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The cabin that had seemed cozy and safe in daylight now felt vulnerable. I kept the stove fire burning high, lit every lamp I could find, and sat as close to the center of the room as possible. Every small noise from outside made me flinch. Then it happened. A sound I could not explain. A thump, low and deliberate, against the cabin wall. Then another, and another, not like an animal brushing against the wood. Something heavier, deliberate, trying to make its presence known. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife from the counter, feeling the cold metal in my hand, and moved toward the bedroom door to barricade myself. I couldn't see anything through the windows, but the sound continued, slow and steady, around the cabin. It was circling, testing me. I realized then that I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was outside, aware of me. My mind raced. I didn't have a plan. I could call the police, but the signal was almost non-existent. I thought about barricading the door with furniture, but the thought of stepping outside even for a second to do it made me freeze. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, the knife shaking in my hand. The thumps continued intermittently, never constant, always shifting, always just far enough that I couldn't see the source. Hours passed. Time stretched in a way that made everything feel distorted. I didn't sleep. I didn't move from my central spot in the living room. The noises outside faded by morning, replaced by the mundane sounds of the forest again. Birds chirping, wind in the trees. It was almost unbearable to leave the safety of the cabin, but I needed to see if anything had happened. When I stepped outside, I saw footprints. Large, heavy boots in the soft soil, circling the cabin in a pattern that suggested someone had been watching me all night. They stopped and started again, moving around every side of the cabin. There were marks on the door frame, scratches, and small dents where the wood had been struck. I took pictures with my phone, my hands trembling. This was no animal. Someone had been here, watching me, testing my nerves, and I had no way of knowing why or how long they had been planning it. I knew then that staying was no longer safe. I packed as quickly as I could, grabbing everything I needed, leaving nothing behind. I locked the cabin the best I could, put the key back in the hiding spot the owner had suggested, and began the long walk back to the road. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, made me flinch. I kept looking over my shoulder, imagining someone following, waiting for the right moment. I kept my knife in hand, ready for anything. Eventually, I reached my car. Relief washed over me, but the adrenaline didn't fade. I drove out of the forest slowly, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, until I hit the main road. The isolation that had seemed appealing before now felt like a trap. I kept driving until I reached a small town with gas stations and streetlights, the first sign of human activity in miles. I parked, called the police, and gave them the details. They said they would send someone to check the cabin, but it would take time. The idea that whoever had circled the cabin could still be out there, watching, was almost too much to bear. Days later, I received a call from the local authorities. They had checked the cabin and surrounding area. There were no signs of the person, but the footprints and marks were still there. They suggested I never go back. The experience stayed with me for weeks, the sense of being watched, the fear of being alone in an isolated place. But I also learned something about myself. I had survived, I had stayed calm enough to escape, and I had made it out without getting hurt. That realization gave me a small, hard-earned confidence. I wasn't careless. I wasn't naive. I had faced something that could have ended badly and made it through. Even now, months later, I think about that cabin. The forest, the quiet, the way the isolation had shifted from peaceful to threatening in a single night. The memories are vivid, every detail etched into my mind. The creak of the floorboards, the smell of the wood, the faint scratches on the door frame, the steady rhythm of heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I never returned, and I never will. But the experience changed me. I am more cautious now, more aware of the danger that can lurk in the most seemingly peaceful places. And I am grateful, profoundly grateful, that I walked out alive.